For those of you who have been with us from the beginning, thank you. We are about to go even deeper into the dust and silence of the ancient world, uncovering more remarkable objects that reach out across thousands of years and connect us to the world of the Bible in ways that will leave you speechless. From hidden treasures and forgotten scrolls to ancient inscriptions and sacred sites still waiting to give up their secrets, Part 2 promises to be every bit as moving and as extraordinary as Part 1. Before we dive in, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It truly helps more people find this content, and it means the world to this community we're building together. Now, let's continue our journey. The Samaria Ivories. In the ancient city of Samaria, the capital of the northern kingdom of Israel, built by King Omri in the 9th century BCE on a hill he purchased for the sum of 2 talents of silver, developed by his son Ahab into one of the most impressive royal cities in the ancient Levant. Archaeologists working in the early 20th century found in the ruins of the royal palace a remarkable collection of carved ivory objects. They numbered in the hundreds, plaques and panels and small figurines, decorated with the same rich mixture of Egyptian, Phoenician, and Mesopotamian artistic motifs that characterize the Megiddo ivories we visited earlier in our journey, and bearing silent witness to the luxury and the cultural sophistication of the Israelite royal court at its height. The Samaria Ivories are directly relevant to one of the most memorable passages in the biblical prophetic literature. The prophet Amos, a shepherd and fig tree tender from the Judean village of Tekoa, who brought his message north to the kingdom of Israel in the 8th century BCE, delivers a series of devastating oracles against the wealthy elite of Samaria, condemning their injustice toward the poor and their complacent enjoyment of luxury in a society riven with inequality. Among his most specific condemnations is an oracle against those who lie on beds of ivory and stretch out on their couches, who drink wine by the bowlful and anoint themselves with the finest oils, but who feel no grief for the ruin of Joseph. The phrase beds of ivory is not a poetic abstraction. It is a description of actual furniture, of beds and couches inlaid with carved ivory panels of exactly the kind found in the ruins of the Samaria palace. The ivories that Amos condemned have been sitting in museum cases in Jerusalem and London and Amman for nearly a century. They are beautiful, genuinely, undeniably beautiful, carved with a skill and a delicacy that commands admiration regardless of the moral context in which they were produced. The sphinx that crouches on one plaque, the lotus flowers that frame another, the woman's face peering from a window in one of the most famous of the ivories, all of it is the product of craftsmen of exceptional ability, working in a tradition of extraordinary refinement. And that is part of what makes Amos's oracles so sharp. He is not condemning ugliness. He is condemning the indifference that beauty can enable, the way that the enjoyment of fine things can coexist with, and even depend upon, the suffering of those who cannot afford them. The Samaria ivories are beautiful, and they are the objects that a prophet looked at and saw, behind the beauty, the injustice that made them possible. Both things are true simultaneously. Both things have always been true simultaneously. That is one of the oldest and most uncomfortable truths the ancient world has to offer us. The Theodotus inscription. In 1913, a French archaeologist named Raymond, while was excavating in the city of David, the oldest part of Jerusalem, the narrow ridge south of the Temple Mount where the earliest settlement of the city was established, when his team discovered a limestone block bearing a Greek inscription. The block had been reused as part of a cistern lining, which is why it survived, its text face protected by the water that had flowed around it for centuries. When the inscription was cleaned and studied, it turned out to be one of the most significant New Testament period discoveries ever made in Jerusalem. The Theodotus inscription, as it came to be known, records the dedication of a synagogue by a man named Theodotus, son of Vetanus, who is identified as a priest and an archysynagogos, a ruler or head of the synagogue, following in the same role as his father and grandfather before him. The inscription states that Theodotus built the synagogue for the reading of the law and the teaching of the commandments, and also built a hostelry and chambers and water installations for the lodging of those who have need from abroad. The inscription dates to the late Second Temple period, before the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 CE, and it is the only pre-destruction inscription ever found in Jerusalem that specifically mentions a synagogue. It describes an institution that is already well established and multi-generational. Theodotus is the third generation of his family to lead this synagogue, and it speaks of a facility that served not just local worshippers but Jewish pilgrims coming to Jerusalem from the diaspora who needed accommodation and hospitality during their visit to the Holy City. The hostelry and the water installations it mentions are practical provisions for a real community with real needs, travelers who had come a long way and needed somewhere to sleep and wash. Some scholars have connected the Theodotus synagogue with the synagogue of the freedmen mentioned in the book of Acts, a synagogue whose members disputed with Stephen, the first Christian martyr, in Jerusalem in the years after the crucifixion. The connection is speculative, but not implausible. What is certain is that the inscription describes the kind of institution and the kind of community that the Acts narrative takes for granted as part of the landscape of first-century Jerusalem, the synagogue as a center of Jewish life, of learning, of community, of hospitality to pilgrims from across the diaspora. The stone on which that description is carved was lying in a cistern in the city of David, waiting to be found, while the city it came from was destroyed and rebuilt and destroyed again and rebuilt again over 2,000 years of turbulent history. The Babylonian Chronicles. In the British Museum, in the same vast collection that holds the Cyrus cylinder and the black obelisk and the Lachish reliefs, there is a series of clay tablets known collectively as the Babylonian Chronicles, a set of ancient historical records compiled by Babylonian scribes, recording year by year the significant events of Babylonian history from the late 8th century BC through the Hellenistic period. They are not literary texts. They are administrative records, analytic summaries of military campaigns, changes of reign, astronomical observations, and significant events, written in a terse and factual style that makes them among the most reliable historical sources to survive from the ancient Near East. Among the tablets in the Babylonian Chronicles series, one has attracted particular attention from scholars of the Hebrew Bible, the tablet known as the Jerusalem Chronicle or the Nebuchadnezzar Chronicle, which records events from the reign of the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar II in the early 6th century BC. The tablet records, in the entry for Nebuchadnezzar's 7th year, which corresponds to approximately 597 BC, that the Babylonian king marched to the land of Hutti, besieged the city of Judah, captured it on the 2nd day of the month of Adar, appointed a king of his own choosing, took heavy tribute, and carried the king and his court into exile in Babylon. The city of Judah, referred to in the tablet, is Jerusalem. The king who was exiled is Jehoiakim, the young king of Judah who surrendered to Nebuchadnezzar and was taken to Babylon, where he lived for decades in the Babylonian court. His exile is described in the second book of Kings and in the book of Jeremiah, and it marks the beginning of the Babylonian exile, one of the most formative and most devastating events in the history of ancient Israel, the event that the Book of Lamentations mourns and that the later chapters of Isaiah address with words of comfort and hope. The Babylonian Chronicle records this event in the same terse, administrative language it uses for every other event it describes. The captured Jerusalem is granted no more space or rhetorical weight than the record of a military campaign against any other city. It was, from the Babylonian perspective, one conquest among many, one tribute among many, one exiled king among many. The asymmetry between the weight of the event in the biblical tradition, where it marks a catastrophic rupture in the life of a people, a moment of theological crisis, a question about the faithfulness of God that the whole subsequent tradition wrestles with, and the weight it receives in the Babylonian Chronicle, 3 lines of matter-of-fact administrative prose, is itself a kind of historical lesson. The events that define a people are not always the events that the record-keepers of other peoples consider worth more than a passing notation. History is told differently depending on where you are standing when it happens. The En-Gedi Synagogue Inscription. On the western shore of the Dead Sea, in an oasis of extraordinary beauty where freshwater springs pour down from the cliffs into the desert, and where David hid from Saul in the wilderness, there stood in the Byzantine period a Jewish community that has left behind one of the most remarkable synagogue floor inscriptions ever discovered in the ancient world. The site is En-Gedi, mentioned in the Song of Solomon, in the Book of Joshua, in the first book of Samuel, and the inscription was found in the floor of a 6th century CE synagogue excavated there in the 1970s. The En-Gedi synagogue inscription is a long text in Hebrew and Aramaic, covering a significant portion of the synagogue floor in Mosaic lettering. It contains several distinct sections, a list of the signs of the zodiac and the months of the year, a list of the patriarchs from Adam through the 12 sons of Jacob, a list of the 3 pious men of the Bible, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, who survived the fiery furnace in the book of Daniel, and a lengthy curse against anyone who reveals the secret of the town to the Gentiles, causes dissension, or slanders his fellow. The inscription ends with a blessing for the members of the community who are righteous before God. The curse section is the most unusual and the most discussed element of the inscription. It warns in strong terms against revealing an unspecified secret, a secret significant enough that its disclosure to outsiders is treated as equivalent in seriousness to causing communal dissension or slandering one's neighbors. Scholars have debated what this secret might be. Some have suggested it was a secret relating to the calendar, others a trade secret relating to the production of balsam, the precious aromatic resin for which En-Gedi was famous in antiquity and which was one of the most valuable commodities in the ancient economy. The balsam groves of En-Gedi are mentioned by ancient authors from Pliny to Josephus, and the community's prosperity may well have depended on guarding the methods of its cultivation and production. The inscription is now displayed in the Israel Museum in Jerusalem, its mosaic letters preserved with their original colors partially intact, the words of the ancient community's blessing and curse legible after 15 centuries of silence. The synagogue that housed it was destroyed by fire, the same fire that preserved the inscription by protecting it under a layer of ash and debris, sometime in the late 6th or early 7th century CE. The community that cursed its betrayers and blessed its righteous members was gone, its secret perhaps lost with it, its words surviving in the floor it walked on, patient as mosaic, enduring as stone. The Deir Alla inscription. In 1967, Archaeologists excavating a site in the Jordan Valley called Tel Deir Alla, a site associated by some scholars with the biblical Sukkos, made a discovery that caused significant excitement in the world of ancient Near Eastern studies and has been generating scholarly debate ever since. In the ruins of a building destroyed by an earthquake sometime around 800 BC, they found fragments of a plaster wall inscription, text written in ink on the white plaster of a wall, in a language that proved to be a previously unknown Aramaic dialect, in an alphabet that combined features of several known scripts. The text, when assembled from its fragments and partially deciphered, proved to contain something extraordinary, a prophecy attributed to a figure named Balaam, son of Beer. Balaam, son of Beer, is one of the most unusual figures in the Hebrew Bible, a non-Israelite seer or diviner from Mesopotamia who appears in the Book of Numbers, hired by the Moabite king Balak to curse Israel as they moved through the wilderness, but who instead, under divine compulsion, blesses Israel in a series of oracles of considerable literary beauty. He is described in the biblical text as a man of genuine prophetic ability, someone who hears the words of God and sees the vision of the Almighty, even though he stands entirely outside the Israelite tradition. He has a speaking donkey. He has a genuine encounter with the divine. And then he disappears from the main narrative, only to reappear later in a context that casts his motives in a much darker light. The Deir Alla inscription describes a vision received by Balaam, son of Beer, a vision of divine messengers and cosmic catastrophe, of the gods convening to determine the fate of the world, of darkness and destruction coming upon the earth. The text is fragmentary and its interpretation is disputed, but the identification of its central figure with the Balaam of the biblical text is widely accepted. Here, in a plaster inscription from a building in the Jordan Valley, is a reference to a figure who also appears in the Book of Numbers, a figure who is apparently known and celebrated across a wider region of the ancient Near East as a significant prophetic personality, not just within the specific tradition of the Hebrew Bible, but in the broader religious and cultural world of the ancient Levant. The inscription is now housed in the Jordan Archaeological Museum in Amman, its fragments carefully assembled and displayed. The plaster on which it was written is fragile. The medium was never intended for permanent preservation, and the earthquake that destroyed the building also shattered the wall and scattered the fragments across the floor. That any of it survived at all is a matter of fortunate accident. That it survived to tell us that Balaam, son of Beer, was a figure of regional significance, known and invoked by communities across the Jordan Valley in the 9th and 8th centuries BCE, is a gift from that accident that the ancient world did not intend to give and that the modern world is still learning to receive. The Horvat copper mines. In the southern Negev desert of Israel, in a landscape of extraordinary geological drama, red sandstone cliffs rising from a flat valley floor, the stone twisted and layered by millions of years of geological pressure into formations of almost hallucinatory beauty. There are ancient copper mines whose history reaches back to the early Iron Age and whose relationship to the biblical world has been the subject of passionate archaeological debate for decades. The site is called Timna, and it lies in the Araba Valley just north of the Gulf of Aqaba. And the copper ore that was extracted there was smelted in furnaces that burned with a heat intense enough to leave behind slag heaps that are still visible in the landscape today. The copper mines of Timna were worked at various periods across a span of several thousand years, from the Chalcolithic period through the Byzantine era. But the period of most intensive exploitation appears to have been the 12th and 11th centuries BCE. The early Iron Age, the period that in the biblical chronology corresponds to the time of the judges and the early monarchy. The question that has fascinated and divided archaeologists is who is doing the mining and the smelting during that period, and whether that activity has any connection to the biblical account of the Israelites and their neighbors. The site includes a sanctuary, a small tent shrine, its evidence preserved in the archaeological record that appears to have been used by the workers and managers of the copper operation for religious rituals. Among the objects found at the sanctuary are a bronze serpent, a cultic object whose parallel in the biblical text is the bronze serpent that Moses made in the wilderness, described in the Book of Numbers, and textiles of remarkable preservation, including fabrics dyed with colors that indicate considerable craft sophistication. The textiles, preserved by the extraordinary dryness of the Negev environment, include purple-dyed wool, the same costly purple dye produced from the murex shellfish that the Bible associates with priestly vestments and royal luxury, which speaks of a level of material culture significantly higher than that of simple miners or slaves. The Timna mines are a reminder that the biblical world was an economic world as well as a theological one, a world of raw materials and trade routes and production facilities, of workers who smelted copper in the desert heat and carried their product north along the trade routes of the Araba, of a regional economy in which control of mineral resources was a source of wealth and power. The landscape in which they worked is still there, still red and dramatic and largely unchanged, the slag heaps still visible against the sandstone cliffs, the desert air still carrying the same dry silence that it carried when the furnaces burned and the copper flowed. The Codex Alexandrinus. In the British Library in London, displayed in the same room as the Codex Sinaiticus that we visited earlier in our journey, there is another of the great manuscript Bibles of the ancient world, the Codex Alexandrinus, a 5th century CE manuscript written in Greek on vellum, containing most of the Old and New Testaments along with 2 early Christian texts not found in most modern Bibles. It is one of the 4 great uncial codices, manuscripts written in capital Greek letters, that form the foundation of the textual tradition of the Christian Bible, and it is one of the oldest and most important witnesses to the biblical text in the Greek tradition. The Codex Alexandrinus takes its name from Alexandria in Egypt, where it was kept for centuries before being brought to Constantinople and eventually given to the King of England in 1627 as a diplomatic gift by the Patriarch of Constantinople, Cyril Lucaris. It arrived in England at a moment of particular significance for the history of the English Bible, just 16 years after the publication of the King James Version in 1611, too late for the translators of that monumental work to have access to it, but early enough to influence the subsequent tradition of biblical scholarship and translation. Scholars who examined the Codex Alexandrinus in the 17th and 18th centuries were struck by the ways in which it differed, in places, from the texts that had been used for earlier translations. Variations in wording, differences in the inclusion or exclusion of certain passages, readings that open new questions about the history of the biblical text transmission. The Codex Alexandrinus includes, in addition to the canonical biblical books, the first and second epistles of Clement, early Christian letters not included in the New Testament canon but widely read and respected in the early church. Their presence in the Codex is a reminder that the boundaries of the biblical canon were not fixed as firmly or as early as later tradition often suggests, that the early church read a wider range of texts than eventually made it into the canonical collection, and that the process of defining which texts were authoritative and which were not was a long and complex one that unfolded over several centuries. The Codex Alexandrinus preserves, In its selection of texts and in the variations of its wording, traces of that process, a manuscript tradition that was still somewhat fluid, still in conversation with the wider world of early Christian literature, before the boundaries hardened into the form we now know. The Hazor destruction layer. The ancient city of Hazor, described in the book of Joshua as formerly the head of all those kingdoms, the greatest and most powerful of the Canaanite city-states of the Late Bronze Age, sits on a large mound in the Upper Galilee region of northern Israel, its accumulated layers of occupation rising from the surrounding plain in a tell that has been systematically excavated since the 1950s, first by the great Israeli archaeologist Yigal Yadin, and subsequently by Amnon Ben-Tor and a team from the Hebrew University. The excavations at Hazor have been among the most productive and most significant in the history of Israeli archaeology, and they have produced evidence of a destruction so complete and so violent that its remnants still speak, 3,000 years later, of an event of extraordinary intensity. The destruction layer at Hazor, a thick stratum of ash and burned debris dating to approximately the 13th century BCE, contains evidence of deliberate, systematic demolition and burning. The statues of the Canaanite gods that stood in Hazor's temples were not merely toppled. They were mutilated, their faces smashed, their hands broken off, in acts that speak of ideological as well as physical destruction. The palace was burned. The temples were burned. The administrative buildings were burned. And the city was not rebuilt on the Canaanite model. What replaced it was a much simpler, less architecturally sophisticated settlement of a type that archaeologists associate with the early Israelite presence in the region. The book of Joshua describes the destruction of Hazor explicitly and in terms that match the archaeological evidence with striking precision. Joshua turned back and captured Hazor and put its king to the sword. Joshua burned Hazor itself. The biblical account describes the smashing of Canaanite religious objects as a specific commandment, a theological requirement, not merely a military convenience, which is consistent with the deliberate mutilation of the statues found in the destruction layer. The dating of the destruction and its attribution to the Israelites described in the Joshua narrative is one of the most vigorously debated questions in the archaeology of ancient Israel, and scholars who study it hold a range of views that do not admit of easy resolution. What is not in dispute is the destruction itself, the burned palaces and temples, the mutilated gods, the thick layer of ash that buried a great city at the end of the Late Bronze Age and left it for archaeologists to find 3,000 years later. Whatever happened at Hazor, and whoever did it, was thorough and final. The city that had been the head of all those kingdoms never recovered its Bronze Age grandeur. It became something else, smaller, different, part of a new landscape of the early Iron Age that was still finding its shape. The ash layer is real. The mutilated statues are real. And they are waiting, as everything in the ground of the ancient world waits, for the questions that will make them yield their final meaning. The Pilgrimage Road of Jerusalem. We close this portion of our journey not with a single artifact but with a space, a street, a path, a way, that is both an archaeological discovery and a lived experience, both a physical remnant of the ancient world and an active site of ongoing excavation whose full extent is still being revealed. The Pilgrimage Road of Jerusalem, sometimes called the Step Street or the Jerusalem Road, was a broad, paved street that ran from the Pool of Siloam at the southern end of the city of David, northward through the lower city toward the Temple Mount. It was built in the 1st century CE, during the reign of Herod Agrippa, as the final major construction project of a Second Temple period, and it served as the primary route by which Jewish pilgrims ascended from the city's lower quarters toward the temple. The route walked by hundreds of thousands of people during the great pilgrimage festivals of Passover, Shavuot, and Sukkot. The route along which the crowds moved who are described in the Gospel accounts of Jesus' final week in Jerusalem. The road is approximately 8 meters wide and paved with large, carefully fitted limestone slabs. It has a drainage channel running beneath it, and the excavation of that channel has produced an extraordinary assemblage of finds from the period of the road's use and destruction: coins, pottery, stone vessels, and personal objects dropped or discarded along the road during the decades of its use. And in the final catastrophic days of 70 CE, when the Roman army of Titus burned the city above, and the people hiding in the drainage channel below left behind whatever they were carrying when the end came. The pilgrimage road is still being excavated, a collaboration between the Israel Antiquities Authority and the City of David Foundation that has been underway for years and has revealed the road's extent progressively, section by section, as the work advances northward through the densely built modern neighborhood above it. Walking the portion of the road that has been open to visitors, the large limestone slabs still level under your feet, the channel beneath still intact, the width of the street still suggesting the crowds that once moved along it, is one of the closest experiences available to any visitor to Jerusalem of physical contact with the world that the New Testament describes. The stones are the same stones. The slope is the same slope. The direction is the same direction, upward, toward the Temple Mount, toward the place where the temple stood, and where so much of the story that has shaped the world was set. The pilgrimage road will continue to be excavated. New finds will continue to emerge from the drainage channel and from the fill beneath the paving stones. The ancient city will continue to give up its evidence, carefully, partially, in the patient rhythm of archaeological work that proceeds one bucket of soil at a time, one catalogued shirt at a time, one measured photograph at a time. The city that was destroyed in 70 CE is still there, beneath the city that was built on its ruins, and beneath the city built on those ruins, layer upon layer of human habitation and human history, each layer preserving something of what came before, each layer waiting for the question that will reveal what it holds. The Moabite stone revisited. There are artifacts in the ancient world that reward a second visit, objects whose surface yields more the longer you look at it, whose story deepens the more context you bring to it, whose significance has accumulated across the decades of scholarship that have wrestled with what it contains. The Mesha stele, the Moabite stone, is one of those artifacts, and having traveled so far together through the landscape of biblical archaeology, we are now better equipped to sit with it more fully than we were when we first encountered it at the beginning of our journey. The stele was commissioned by Mesha, king of Moab, sometime around 840 BCE, and it records his military victories over the Israelite kingdom and his building projects in the territory he controlled. We have already noted that it contains one of the earliest known inscriptions mentioning the name of the God of Israel, and that its account of the conflict between Moab and Israel corresponds to events described in the second book of Kings. But there is more to be said about this extraordinary object, more that the years of scholarship since its discovery have added to our understanding of what it contains and what it means. In recent years, a team of researchers applying new imaging technologies to a paper squeeze of the stele, the impression taken before the stone was broken, which preserves the text of certain damaged sections more clearly than the stone itself, announced a reading of a partially preserved word in line 30, one of the inscription that, if correct, would make the Mesha stele the second ancient inscription, after the Tel Deir Alla. to contain a reference to the House of David. The reading is disputed, the letters are damaged and their reconstruction is uncertain, and the scholarly debate around it has been vigorous and detailed and is not yet resolved. But the possibility that the Moabite king's boastful inscription contains a reference to the Davidic dynasty, the royal line that the biblical tradition places at the center of Israelite history, adds another layer to the already rich significance of this object. What strikes one, sitting with the Misha's stele after this long journey, is the humanity of the man who commissioned it. Misha was a king who had been subject to Israelite domination and who had won his freedom through military effort. He was proud of what he had accomplished. He wanted to say so in a form that would last. He chose stone, as kings always chose when they wanted permanence. He chose a skilled craftsman who produced an inscription of considerable literary quality. The Moabite language in which it is written is closely related to Hebrew, and the text has a rhetorical sophistication that speaks of a scribal tradition of real accomplishment. He dedicated his victories to his god Chemosh, in the same way that the Israelite texts dedicate their victories to the God of Israel, the same structure of divine favor and human response, the same grammar of sacred history, expressed in the religious vocabulary of a neighboring and competing tradition. The stele sits in the Louvre, as it has for more than a century, its black basalt surface polished by the hands that set it up and darkened by the centuries that passed over it. The squeeze that preserves its most contested section sits in libraries and digital archives, being studied by scholars with imaging technologies that Misha could not have imagined and that the 19th century archaeologists who first found it could barely have dreamed of. The stone is the same stone. The debate around it is alive and ongoing. And somewhere in those damaged letters, in the partial word that may or may not name the House of David, the ancient world is still composing its testimony, still not quite finished saying everything it has to say, still holding something back, still inviting the next generation of readers to come and look more carefully at what has always been there. The Horvat, Yuza Ostrakhan. In the Negev desert of southern Israel, at a small Iron Age fortress site called Horvat, Yuza, archaeologists excavating in the 1980s found an inscribed pottery sherd that has attracted particular attention for what it reveals about the religious life of ordinary people in the final years of the Kingdom of Judah. The site itself is a modest military outpost, one of a chain of fortresses that guarded the southern approaches to Judah in the late 7th and early 6th centuries BCE, manned by soldiers and administrators whose daily lives are partially recoverable from the archaeological remains of their occupation. The Horvat, Yuza Ostrakhan, is a letter, written in ink on a pottery sherd in the late biblical Hebrew of the period, that addresses a dispute between the letter writer and someone who has apparently taken something that belongs to him. The letter is indignant, its tone sharp with the particular quality of anger that comes from feeling wronged and wanting to say so clearly. But what makes it significant for the history of Israelite religion is a phrase that appears near its opening, a formula invoking the blessing of the God of Israel on the letter's recipient, in language that is consistent with the devotional vocabulary of the period's biblical texts. The Ostrakhan is significant not for any dramatic historical revelation but for something quieter and more intimate, for what it tells us about the way that the language of faith was woven into the fabric of everyday communication in ancient Judah. The soldiers and administrators who lived at Horvat, Yuza, were not priests or scribes producing official religious texts. They were military personnel, writing practical letters about practical disputes. And yet the language of those letters was saturated with the language of their faith, with blessing formulas and divine names and the casual invocation of a god whose presence was simply assumed to be part of every transaction, every communication, every ordinary moment of a life lived in a desert fortress on the edge of a kingdom. This is the ancient world at its most human, not the world of kings and prophets and great events, but the world of a soldier with a grievance and a piece of broken pottery and a reed pen and something he needed to say. The Ostracon preserves that moment with a fidelity that no literary source can quite match, because literary sources are shaped by the conventions of their genre and the intentions of their authors, while a letter scratched in anger onto a pottery sherd in a desert fortress is simply itself a moment of ordinary human experience, preserved by accident in the dry Negev air, waiting across 26 centuries for someone to read it and recognize, in its indignation and its faith, something entirely and timelessly familiar. The Copper Age Nahal Mishmar Treasure. In 1961, archaeologists rappelling down the cliffs of the Judean desert above the western shore of the Dead Sea, searching the caves that had already yielded the Dead Sea Scrolls a decade earlier, found something entirely different and entirely unexpected. In a cave on the cliff face above Nahal Mishmar, a dry streambed in the wilderness south of En-Gedi, they discovered a cache of objects wrapped in a reed mat, placed in the cave by human hands and then forgotten for 5,000 years. When the mat was unrolled, it revealed the most extraordinary collection of prehistoric metalwork ever found in the ancient Near East. The Nahal Mishmar treasure, as it came to be called, consists of 429 objects, the vast majority of them made of copper, with a smaller number made of ivory and stone and hippopotamus bone. The copper objects include mace heads, scepters, crowns, wands, and containers of extraordinary variety and sophistication, produced using techniques of lost wax casting that represent some of the earliest evidence of this metallurgical method anywhere in the world. The objects date to the Chalcolithic period, the Copper Age, approximately 3500 to 4000 BC, making them more than 5,500 years old. They predate the biblical period by more than 2,000 years. And yet they are relevant to this journey because they speak of the deep roots of the cultural and religious world from which the biblical tradition eventually emerged, of a world already sophisticated in its craft production, already organized enough to create objects of considerable ritual significance, already living in the landscape of the southern Levant that would eventually become the landscape of the Bible. The objects in the Nahal Mishmar treasure are believed to have been cult objects, items used in religious rituals, perhaps associated with a sanctuary or a priestly tradition, hidden in the cave for safekeeping during a period of danger and never retrieved. The crowns and scepters among them have the quality of ceremonial objects, too elaborate and too impractical for everyday use, shaped to be seen and held in ritual contexts, to convey authority and sacred significance in ways that their material beauty would have reinforced. Someone carried them to that cave, wrapped them carefully in a reed mat, placed them in a natural niche in the cliff face, and left them there. Whatever emergency prompted that act of concealment, whatever hope of return accompanied it, neither the emergency nor the hope left any trace in the historical record. Only the objects remain, gleaming still, after 5,000 years, with the particular luster of ancient copper, in their cases in the Israel Museum in Jerusalem, speaking of a world so old that it lies entirely beyond the reach of written memory. The Samaritan Pentateuch. Among the most significant and most debated textual artifacts in the study of the Hebrew Bible is one that is not a single manuscript but a textual tradition, a version of the first 5 books of the Bible, the Torah or Pentateuch, that has been preserved by the Samaritan community across more than 2,000 years of continuous transmission, and that differs from the standard Jewish text in approximately 6,000 places, most of them minor, but some of them theologically significant. The Samaritans, the community whose origins, identity, and relationship to ancient Israel are described in the Book of Kings and disputed across centuries of Jewish and Samaritan scholarship, have maintained their own version of the Pentateuch since at least the 4th or 3rd century BCE, when the community at Mount Gerizim, their sacred mountain in the hill country of central Israel, established itself as a distinct religious entity separate from the Jerusalem-centered Judaism of Judea. The Samaritan Pentateuch, as this text is called, is written in a distinctive ancient Hebrew script, the Paleo-Hebrew script that was used in the biblical period before the square Aramaic script that became standard in the post-exilic period, and it has been copied by Samaritan scribes in an unbroken chain of transmission from antiquity to the present day. The Samaritan community today numbers only in the hundreds. They live in 2 communities, one at Holon near Tel Aviv and one at Nablus near ancient Shechem, and they are among the smallest religious communities in the world. But their Pentateuch is one of the oldest witnesses to the biblical text, and the places where it differs from the standard Masoretic text that forms the basis of most modern translations are of considerable interest to scholars working on the history of the biblical text transmission. Some of the Samaritan readings agree with the ancient Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, the Septuagint, against the standard Hebrew text, suggesting that both the Samaritan Pentateuch and the Septuagint preserve, in places, readings from earlier Hebrew manuscripts that the standard Masoretic tradition did not adopt. Some of the differences reflect Samaritan theological concerns, the substitution of Mount Gerizim for Jerusalem as the divinely chosen place of worship, a change that goes to the heart of the historical dispute between Samaritans and Jews over which community is the true heir of the ancient Israelite tradition. The oldest complete Samaritan Pentateuch manuscript still in the possession of the Samaritan community is a scroll kept at their synagogue in Nablus, known as the Abisha Scroll, which the community claims was written by Abisha, great-grandson of Aaron the high priest, in the 13th year of the Israelite settlement of Canaan. Modern scholarship dates the scroll, or at least its oldest portions, to approximately the 11th or 12th century CE, with later additions made in subsequent centuries. The community's claim for its antiquity is part of the living tradition that gives the scroll its sacred significance, an object whose meaning is inseparable from the story told about it, from the chain of transmission it represents, from the community that has carried it through 2,000 years of survival against considerable odds. The Megiddo Seal of Jeroboam. We have visited the seal of Shema, servant of Jeroboam, already in our journey, that beautiful jasper seal with the crouching lion, now lost, its whereabouts unknown since it was gifted to an Ottoman sultan in the 19th century. But the world of ancient Hebrew seals and seal impressions is rich enough to return to, and there is another seal from the same general period and the same general milieu of the Israelite royal court that deserves its own moment of attention. Among the hundreds of ancient Hebrew seals and bulli that have been found over the decades in controlled excavations and on the antiquities market, in the soil of Israel and Jordan, and in the collections of museums and private collectors around the world, a significant number bear names that appear in the biblical text. The correspondence between the names on the seals and the names in the books of Kings and Jeremiah and Chronicles is not always conclusive. Many of the names were common in the ancient Israelite world, and the presence of the same name on a seal and in a biblical text does not by itself establish that they refer to the same individual. But the accumulation of these correspondences across the entire corpus of ancient Hebrew epigraphy builds a picture of a world that is increasingly recognizable as the world the biblical texts describe. The seal impressions found at Lachish, at Arad, at Megiddo, at Samaria, and at dozens of other sites form a prosopography of the ancient Israelite administrative world, a partial register of the officials, scribes, landowners, and courtiers who kept the kingdoms of Israel and Judah functioning across the centuries of their existence. Their names are preserved in the clay that recorded their transactions, in the storage jars that bore the mark of their authority, in the letters that carried their messages from one administrative center to another across the landscape of a world that has otherwise largely vanished. They were real people, living real lives, navigating real political and economic systems, and their seals are the closest thing to a signature that the ancient world could offer, the mark of an individual identity pressed into the clay of a moment that happened to survive. What the seals tell us, collectively, is that the world of the biblical texts was a world of considerable administrative sophistication, a world of literate officials, of documented transactions, of bureaucratic systems that kept records in forms that were meant to be permanent. The prophets who railed against the injustices of that world were railing against a real world, not a symbolic one. The kings whose building projects and military campaigns fill the books of Kings were real kings, administering real kingdoms, employing real officials whose names are pressed into real clay in the collections of the world's great museums. The seals are the punctuation of that world, the small, emphatic marks of individual presence in a system that was larger than any individual, that required their participation and recorded their activity, and then outlasted them by 3,000 years. The Jerash Mosaic Churches. In the ancient city of Gerasa, known today as Jerash, in the northern part of modern Jordan, one of the best-preserved Roman cities in the entire world, there are more than a dozen Byzantine-period churches whose mosaic floors have survived in various states of preservation, collectively representing one of the richest concentrations of early Christian mosaic art anywhere in the ancient Near East. The city of Gerasa is mentioned in the Gospel of Mark in connection with the healing of the Gerasene demoniac, the man possessed by a legion of spirits who lived among the tombs and whom Jesus healed, sending the spirits into a herd of pigs that rushed into the sea, though the exact geographical identification of the biblical Gerasenes has been debated by scholars. The churches of Jerash were built and decorated across the 5th, 6th, and 7th centuries CE, during the Byzantine period when the city was a prosperous Christian community and the great colonnaded streets and forums of the Roman city were being gradually adapted to the rhythms of Christian life. The mosaic floors of these churches are of extraordinary variety and beauty: geometric patterns, floral designs, hunting scenes, pastoral landscapes, portraits of the donors who funded the mosaics, and at several sites, depictions of animals and birds arranged in the manner of the great mosaic tradition of the late antique world. One of the most significant of the Jerash church mosaics is found in the Church of Saints Cosmos and Damian, where a large floor mosaic dating to 533 CE depicts a series of allegorical figures representing the seasons and the earth, surrounded by animals and birds in a composition of considerable sophistication. The church was built adjacent to and in part over the ruins of earlier structures, and its construction represents the transformation of a Roman civic space into a Christian sacred one, a process that occurred across the Byzantine world as the empire's official religion reshaped the physical landscape of its cities. The mosaics of Jerash speak of a Christianity that was deeply embedded in the visual culture of the late antique world, a Christianity that expressed its identity not in opposition to the artistic traditions of the surrounding culture but in continuity with them, adapting and redirecting those traditions toward new theological purposes. The same craftsman who might have laid a mosaic floor in a Roman bathhouse or a wealthy private home could lay a mosaic in a church, using the same techniques, the same materials, the same visual vocabulary, but now in the service of a different community and a different set of meanings. The mosaics endure in the dry Jordanian air, their colors still vivid after 15 centuries, their animals and figures and geometric patterns still speaking of the hands that set them and the communities that walked over them in prayer and worship, and the ordinary rhythms of a life organized around the Christian calendar. The Wilderness Tabernacle Evidence. The tabernacle, the portable sanctuary that the book of Exodus describes in extraordinary detail as the dwelling place of God among the Israelites during their wilderness wanderings, is one of the most elaborately described structures in the entire Hebrew Bible. The text devotes 6 chapters to its construction instructions and several more to the account of its actual building, specifying the dimensions and materials of every component with a precision that has fascinated readers and scholars for millennia. Whether the tabernacle was a historical structure, a literary construction, a retrojection of the later temple into the wilderness period, or some combination of all three, remains one of the most discussed questions in the study of the Pentateuch. What archaeology has contributed to this discussion is not a discovery of the tabernacle itself. No such discovery has been made or could plausibly be expected, but a body of evidence for the broader context of portable sacred structures in the ancient Near East that gives the biblical description a degree of cultural plausibility it might otherwise seem to lack. Egyptian sources from the New Kingdom period, contemporary with the period in which the Exodus is traditionally set, describe portable tent sanctuaries used by Egyptian military campaigns, including a structure associated with Ramesses II that has been compared in its general features to the biblical tabernacle. The existence of such structures in Egyptian military and religious practice means that the concept of a portable sacred tent was not an anachronistic invention of later biblical writers, but a real feature of the ancient Near Eastern world. Additionally, the metals and materials specified for the tabernacle's construction, gold, silver, copper, fine linen, goat hair, ram skins, acacia wood, are all materials consistent with what was available and valued in the ancient Near East of the 2nd millennium BCE. The specific combination of portability and elaborate decoration that the tabernacle represents is not without parallel in the material culture of the ancient world. None of this proves that the tabernacle existed as described, but it situates the description in a world that could have produced it, a world of portable sacred structures, of elaborate textile arts, of metalworking traditions capable of producing the objects the text describes, of a religious culture that understood the divine presence as something that could travel with a community through a wilderness. The tabernacle, more than almost any other artifact or structure in this journey, exists primarily as a text, as words on a page, as a description in extraordinary detail of something that may or may not have had a physical existence. But texts are artifacts too. The chapters of Exodus that describe the tabernacle's construction are among the most precise and technically detailed passages in the entire Bible, and they speak of a tradition, oral or written or both, that preserved the memory of a sacred structure with the care and specificity of people for whom that structure mattered enormously. Whether they were remembering something that existed or imagining something that should exist, or both simultaneously, The text they produced is a remarkable document, a blueprint for a portable heaven, a description of what it would look like for the divine to live among a wandering people, carried forward through the wilderness on the shoulders of those who had been commanded to make it. The Masada Scrolls and Lots. On the great rock plateau of Masada, the fortress palace that Herod the Great built above the Dead Sea, the site of the last stand of Jewish rebels against Rome in 73 CE, Yigal Yadin's excavations in the 1960s found, in addition to the remains of the siege and the community that died there, a small collection of texts that added a literary dimension to the archaeological drama of the site. The Masada scrolls are fragmentary. They do not approach the scope or preservation of the Dead Sea Scrolls, but they are significant for what they confirm about the community that lived and died on the mountain. Among them are fragments of biblical texts, including portions of Psalms, Leviticus, Deuteronomy, and Ezekiel, whose texts are consistent with the standard Masoretic tradition that became the basis of the Hebrew Bible as we know it. There are also fragments of texts known from the Dead Sea Scrolls, including a portion of the Songs of the Sabbath Sacrifice, a liturgical text also found at Qumran, which raises fascinating questions about the relationship between the community at Masada and the community at Qumran, and about the broader circulation of texts within the Jewish world of the 1st century CE. But among the most haunting of all the finds from Masada are 11 small pottery sherds, ostraca, each bearing a single name written in ink. They were found together in the same location, and Yadin proposed that they were the lots by which the last survivors of the Masada community determined who would kill the others before falling on their own sword, in the final moments before the Roman breach of the fortress. The ancient Jewish historian Josephus describes exactly such a scene in his account of the fall of Masada: 10 men chosen by lot to kill the others, then one chosen from among the 10 to kill the remaining 9 before killing himself. The ostraca found by Yadin's team cannot be definitively identified as those lots. The archaeological context allows for other interpretations, but one of the names on the sherds is Ben Yair, and the commander of the Masada defenders, according to Josephus, was a man named Eleazar ben Yair. The sherds are small and plain, functional objects, not beautiful ones, not meant to be preserved or commemorated. If they are what Yadin believed them to be, they are the most intimate and the most devastating artifacts in the entire corpus of biblical archaeology, the physical instruments of a community's final decision, the last objects touched by people who had chosen death over surrender, the material trace of a moment of extremity that has echoed through Jewish history for 2,000 years. They sit in their cases in the Israel Museum, plain and small and unremarkable in appearance, carrying a weight that their size and their simplicity make all the more difficult to look at steadily. The Ketef Jericho Papyri. In the vicinity of ancient Jericho, one of the oldest continuously inhabited cities in the world, a city whose walls the book of Joshua describes falling to the sound of trumpets and the shouting of the Israelite camp, there are caves in the cliffs above the Jordan Valley that have preserved, in their extraordinary dryness, organic materials that would not have survived almost anywhere else. We know this from the scrolls and the textiles and the baskets and the food remains that have been found in similar caves throughout the Judean desert. And from a cave near Jericho, in circumstances that are not entirely clear, some of the material came through the antiquities market rather than controlled excavation. There emerged in the 1980s a collection of papyrus documents that added a significant chapter to the story of the biblical world in the Persian and Hellenistic periods. The Ketef Jericho Papyri, the name refers to the general area of their discovery, include documents in Aramaic from the Persian period, the 4th century BCE, relating to the administrative life of the Jericho region under Persian rule. They are legal and administrative documents, contracts, accounts, lists of names, and they speak of a community living in the shadow of the great city, conducting the ordinary business of life under a foreign imperial administration, writing in the international language of the period, organizing their affairs according to the legal conventions of their time. What makes these documents particularly valuable is the light they shed on the period between the return from Babylonian exile, described in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, and the Hellenistic period that followed Alexander the Great's conquest of the region. This is a period for which the historical record is relatively sparse. The biblical texts are focused on the religious and community-building concerns of the returning exiles, and the broader social and economic life of the region is less fully documented than either the earlier monarchic period or the later Hellenistic and Roman periods. Documents like the Ketef Jericho papyri fill in some of that gap. They show a community that was functioning, transacting business, recording its affairs in writing, living within the structures of Persian imperial administration in ways that the biblical texts only partially illuminate. The Jordan Valley in which Jericho sits is one of the most historically layered landscapes in the world, a deep valley carved by the Jordan River, below sea level, hemmed in by the cliffs of the Judean desert on the west and the hills of Moab and Gilead on the east. The tells of ancient cities rise from the valley floor. The caves in the cliffs above them have preserved documents and textiles and baskets across thousands of years, and the springs that have always made the region habitable still flow, still giving life to the same ground that has been inhabited since the Neolithic period, since the very beginning of urban life, since the first human beings decided that this particular place, with its water and its warmth and its position at the crossroads of ancient trade routes, was worth settling permanently and never leaving. The Great Isaiah Scroll Revisited. We began our journey with the Dead Sea Scrolls, with the image of a young scribe dipping his reed pen into a clay inkwell and writing words that would survive 2,000 years in a cave above the Dead Sea. And it is fitting, as we draw toward the close of this long and gentle passage through the artifacts of the biblical world, to return to the greatest of those scrolls, the Great Isaiah Scroll, and to sit with it one final time, bringing to it everything we have gathered in the course of this journey. The Great Isaiah Scroll is 24 sheets of parchment sewn together end to end, forming a scroll approximately 7 meters long and 30 centimeters tall. It was written by 2 scribes. Scholars have identified a change of hand partway through the scroll, in a clear, careful Hebrew script that is the product of considerable training and considerable care. It contains all 66 chapters of the book of Isaiah, from the opening vision of the heavens and the earth called to witness against Israel to the final verses describing the new creation, the new Jerusalem, the worship of God by all nations. It is the oldest complete manuscript of any book of the Bible ever found, and it predates the next oldest complete Hebrew manuscript of Isaiah by approximately 1,000 years. What the comparison between the Great Isaiah Scroll and the later medieval manuscripts reveals is something that has quietly astonished everyone who has studied it: the degree of consistency across 1,000 years of manuscript transmission. The text of Isaiah in the Great Isaiah Scroll is, with relatively minor variations, the same text of Isaiah that appears in the medieval manuscripts, that was translated into English in the King James Version, that is read in synagogues and churches and printed in millions of Bibles around the world today. The scribal tradition that preserved the biblical text across the centuries between the Dead Sea Scrolls and the medieval manuscripts did so with a fidelity that the discovery of the scrolls confirmed in ways that scholars had hoped for but could not have been certain of before 1947. The scroll is housed in the Shrine of the Book, a building designed to evoke the shape of the jar lids in which the scrolls were found, its white dome rising from a landscape of the Israel Museum's campus in Jerusalem. The scroll is displayed in a circular case, lit softly from below, its Hebrew letters visible through the glass, the same letters that the scribe pressed into the parchment 2,000 years ago in a scriptorium above the Dead Sea, by the light of an oil lamp, in the silence of the desert night. The words he copied are words that have been read and sung and quoted and debated and prayed over for 3,000 years. They were old when he copied them. They are older still now. And they are still being read in Jerusalem, in London, in New York, in Lagos, in Seoul, and Sao Paulo, and every place where the book of Isaiah has traveled in the long journey of its transmission through the world. The scroll endures, the words endure, and the act of reading them, of receiving what the scribe copied and the community preserved and the shepherd boy found and the scholars translated and the museum curators protect, is itself a kind of participation in that long chain of transmission, a small link added to an unbroken sequence of human attention that stretches back to the beginning of the written word and forward, we may hope, to a future that will continue to find in these ancient texts something worth preserving, something worth passing on, something that speaks, across all the distance and all the difference and all the change that the centuries bring, to something enduring in the human heart. The Siloam Pool coins. There is a particular kind of archaeological evidence that does not announce itself dramatically, that does not arrive in the form of a great inscription or a beautifully preserved scroll or a carved monument bearing the name of a known historical figure. It arrives quietly, in the form of small metal discs pressed from bronze or silver or copper, scattered in the soil of an excavation with the casual abundance of things that were once common and are now precious precisely because of what they can tell us about the moment in which they were lost or discarded or simply dropped and not recovered. The coins found in the drainage channel beneath the pilgrimage road in Jerusalem, the great step street that led from the pool of Siloam northward toward the Temple Mount, are that kind of evidence. They are small, many of them corroded, some of them barely legible. But they are datable, and their dates tell a story that no inscription could tell more precisely. The coins found in the fill of the drainage channel beneath the pilgrimage road span a range from the Hasmonean period through the reign of the Roman procurator Valerius Gratus, who governed Judea from 15 to 26 CE. The latest coins found in the channel date to the period immediately before and during the ministry described in the Gospels, the period of Pontius Pilate's governorship, which began in 26 CE. What this means in practical archaeological terms is that the pilgrimage road was built and in use during the precise period described in the Gospel narratives. The coins confirm that the street was a living, functioning thoroughfare during the years when, according to the Gospel accounts, Jesus walked it. They confirm that the pool of Siloam at its southern end was in use during the same period. And they confirm, in the most mundane and therefore the most reliable way possible, that the physical landscape described in the Gospels was real, that the streets and pools and gates and stairways that appear in those narratives were not literary inventions, but actual places in an actual city where actual people dropped actual coins in the drainage channel and went about the business of their lives. The coins themselves are now cataloged and stored in the archives of the Israel Antiquities Authority. They are not on display. They are working documents, pieces of evidence in an ongoing argument about the physical reality of the ancient city. But each one of them was held in a human hand, in a moment of ordinary life in first-century Jerusalem, before it slipped through a grate or fell from a pocket and came to rest in the dark beneath the stones of the street, where it waited 19 centuries for the light of an archaeologist's lamp to find it and bring it back into the human world. The patience of small things is one of the ancient world's most extraordinary qualities. And the patience of these small bronze discs, lying in the dark beneath a Jerusalem street for 2,000 years, has been rewarded with a significance that no one who dropped them there could possibly have imagined. The Lachish Temple. We have visited Lachish before, in the context of the ostraca that recorded the desperate final communications of its garrison in the last days before the Babylonian destruction, and in the context of the Assyrian reliefs that depicted its siege by Sennacherib a century earlier. But Lachish has another story to tell, one that reaches back much further than either the Assyrian or the Babylonian period, into the deeper layers of its history as a Canaanite city and into the evidence of the religious life that those layers preserve. In the ruins of Canaanite Lachish, in the levels dating to the Late Bronze Age, before the Israelite presence in the region, archaeologists working at the site in the 20th century found evidence of a temple that was rebuilt and renovated at least 3 times across the 14th and 13th centuries BCE. The Lachish Temple, as it is called, is one of the best documented Canaanite temples ever excavated, and the objects found within and around it, pottery, bones of animals sacrificed in its rituals, bronze objects, ivory carvings, and inscribed materials, give a detailed picture of the religious practices of the Canaanite community that inhabited the city before the transitions of the early Iron Age. Among the most significant finds associated with the Lachish Temple is a small pottery bowl inscribed with a text in a script that has been the subject of considerable scholarly debate, a Proto-Canaanite or early alphabetic inscription that represents one of the earliest examples of alphabetic writing ever found in the Levant. The alphabet, the great gift of the ancient Semitic world to human civilization, the writing system from which virtually every modern alphabet descends, was developed in the Canaanite-speaking world of the 2nd millennium BCE, and the inscriptions found at sites like Lachish are among the earliest surviving examples of its use. The bowl's inscription is brief and not fully understood, but its significance as a witness to the very earliest phase of alphabetic writing gives it a place in the history of human communication that far transcends the modest circumstances of its discovery. The Lachish Temple was destroyed at the end of the Late Bronze Age, part of the widespread collapse of Bronze Age civilization across the eastern Mediterranean that occurred around 1200 BCE and that left many of the great cities of Canaan in ruins. The temple was not rebuilt in its original form. The world that had produced it was gone, replaced by something new and different, the Iron Age world in which the Israelite presence in the region began to establish itself. The ashes of the temple's last destruction, preserved in the excavation record, are the ashes of a religious world that the biblical texts describe as the alternative against which Israelite monotheism defined itself. And within those ashes, among the shattered pottery and the burned offerings and the fallen walls, lie the earliest letters of an alphabet that would eventually carry the words of the Bible to every corner of the earth. The Elephantine Passover Papyrus. Among the Elephantine papyri, those extraordinary documents from the Jewish military colony on the Nile island of Yeb that we have visited twice already in this journey, there is one that has attracted particular attention from scholars of Jewish religious history. It is known as the Passover Letter, or the Passover Papyrus, and it dates to approximately 419 BC, during the reign of the Persian king Darius II. It is a letter addressed to the Jewish community at Elephantine from a man named Hananiah, who appears to be an emissary from the Jewish authorities in Jerusalem or Persia, and it contains instructions about the observance of the festival of Passover and unleavened bread. The letter is fragmentary. Significant portions of the text are damaged or missing, but enough survives to make clear that it is conveying official instructions about how the community at Elephantine should observe the Passover festival, the specific days on which it should be kept, the dietary restrictions concerning leavened bread, the ritual requirements of the week of unleavened bread that follows the Passover itself. The instructions correspond closely to what the Pentateuch prescribes for the observance of Passover, the same festival that the Book of Exodus presents as the foundational commemoration of the Israelite exodus from Egypt, the same festival that Jesus is described in the Gospels as celebrating in Jerusalem in the week of his death. What makes the Passover letter significant for the history of Jewish religious practice is what it implies about the state of that practice at Elephantine in the 5th century BC. The fact that official instructions about Passover observance needed to be sent from a central authority to the Elephantine community suggests that the community's practice may have been irregular or uncertain, that the standardization of Passover observance that the Pentateuch presupposes was still, in the 5th century BC, a work in progress, still being communicated and enforced across the diaspora communities that had developed their own practices in the absence of regular contact with the Jerusalem authorities. The letter is, in a sense, a document of religious standardization in action, of the process by which a set of practices that the biblical text present as ancient and established was actually being implemented and regularized across the dispersed communities of the Jewish world. The papyrus is housed today in the Egyptian Museum in Berlin, its Aramaic letters still legible on the ancient papyrus, its instructions for a festival that has been observed continuously for more than 2,500 years still recognizable to anyone familiar with the Passover liturgy. The festival it describes is still being celebrated in homes and synagogues around the world, in the same week of the spring calendar that the letter specifies, with many of the same ritual elements that the letter mentions. The chain of transmission from that papyrus to the Passover Seder of the present day is long and complex and passes through many hands and many centuries of adaptation and development. But the chain is unbroken. And the letter from a man named Hananiah to the Jewish community at Elephantine, written on papyrus in Aramaic on a Nile island 24 centuries ago, is one of the earliest surviving links in that chain. The Byzantine Negev churches. In the Negev desert of southern Israel, that vast, arid, starkly beautiful landscape that the biblical texts associate with the wilderness wanderings, with the patriarchal journeys, with the southern margins of the kingdoms of Israel and Judah, there is a group of ancient towns that flourished remarkably during the Byzantine period, from the 4th through the 7th centuries CE, sustained by an agricultural system of extraordinary ingenuity that captured and channeled the rare desert rains into terraced fields and cisterns capable of supporting dense populations in one of the driest environments in the world. The Negev Byzantine towns, Shivda, of Mamshit, Halutza, and several others, were Nabatean in origin, founded by the trading people of the ancient Arabian caravan routes whose capital at Petra in southern Jordan was one of the wonders of the ancient world. In the Byzantine period, they were transformed into Christian communities, their public spaces organized around churches rather than temples, their populations growing, and their agricultural systems expanding to support communities of thousands of people in a landscape that today supports almost no permanent settlement at all. Each of these towns contains multiple churches. Shivda alone has 3, decorated with mosaic floors and carved stone liturgical furniture, their architecture a distinctive regional adaptation of the Byzantine church building tradition to the materials and conditions of the desert. The churches of the Negev Byzantine towns are not among the most famous or most visited of the ancient world's sacred buildings. They lack the grandeur of the great basilicas of Constantinople or Rome, the refinement of the mosaic programs of Ravenna or Thessaloniki. They are desert buildings, built from the local limestone, modest in scale, functional in their design, their decorations simple compared to the great metropolitan churches of the Byzantine world. But they have a quality that the great metropolitan churches sometimes lack, a quality of appropriateness, of fitting their landscape and their community with a rightness that more ambitious buildings can forfeit in the pursuit of grandeur. They were built by people who lived in the desert, for communities that worked the desert, in a tradition that was comfortable with austerity and found in simplicity a form of beauty adequate to the worship they contained. The agricultural systems that sustain these communities, the runoff farms, the terraced fields, the carefully engineered cisterns, are visible in the landscape around the towns, their ancient stonework still partially intact, their logic still legible to anyone who walks the desert hills and looks at how the terraces follow the contours of the land, directing the rare rainfall toward the fields rather than letting it run off uselessly into the wadis. These systems represent one of the most impressive achievements of ancient desert agriculture anywhere in the world, and they are now being studied by modern desert agronomists who see in them models for sustainable farming in arid environments. The Byzantine farmers of the Negev found a way to live in a landscape that their contemporaries in the Mediterranean world might have considered uninhabitable. The churches they built, and the fields they terraced, and the cisterns they carved from the desert rock, are the legacy of that achievement, patient and durable and full of a quiet ingenuity that the desert has preserved with the same fidelity it has always shown to the things that human beings leave within it. The awful inscription. In 2013, archaeologists excavating just south of the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, in the area known as the Awful, the ancient ridge that connected the original city of David to the temple platform, found fragments of a large pottery storage jar that bore, on its shoulder, a few letters inscribed before firing in what appeared to be an alphabetic script. The fragments were pieced together, the inscription was studied, and the result was announced as the oldest alphabetic inscription ever found in Jerusalem, a text dating to approximately the 10th century BCE, the period associated in the biblical texts with the reigns of David and Solomon. The awful inscription, as it came to be called, is brief. Only a few letters survive, and their reading and interpretation are disputed. The script appears to be Proto-Canaanite or Early Hebrew, and some scholars have read it as containing a word related to wine or a similar commodity, a storage label, perhaps, on a jar that held a valued substance. Others have proposed different readings. The inscription does not contain a royal name or a divine name or any of the historically significant elements that would make it immediately famous. It is, in the most literal sense, a label on a jar. And yet its significance is considerable. An alphabetic inscription from 10th century BCE Jerusalem, from the period of the early Israelite monarchy, is exactly the kind of evidence that scholars have long sought for the existence of literacy and administrative record-keeping in Jerusalem at the time the biblical texts placed the courts of David and Solomon there. One of the persistent criticisms of the biblical account of a sophisticated Davidic Solomonic empire has been the relative scarcity of epigraphic evidence from Jerusalem itself for that period, the absence of inscriptions that would confirm the existence of a literate administrative apparatus in the city during the 10th century BCE. The awful inscription is a small but real piece of such evidence, a fragment of a jar label that tells us that someone in 10th century BCE Jerusalem could write, was writing on storage jars, was labeling commodities in an alphabetic script that is the ancestor of the Hebrew writing system. Small evidence. But the ancient world gives up its evidence in small pieces, and each small piece matters. The El-Borg inscriptions. At a site in the northern Sinai Peninsula called El-Borg, a site that straddles the ancient military and trade route between Egypt and Canaan, known as the Way of Horus, or the Ways of Horus, the road that the book of Exodus describes God steering the Israelites away from because it was too heavily fortified. Excavations conducted in the late 1990s and early 2000s by a team led by the American Egyptologist James Hoffmeyer found evidence of an Egyptian military fortress dating to the New Kingdom period, the era most commonly associated with the Exodus narrative. The site produced a range of Egyptian military and administrative artifacts, pottery, bronze weapons, scarabs, and most significantly, fragments of inscribed material including a cartouche bearing the name of the pharaoh Thutmose III, one of the great military pharaohs of the New Kingdom period. The fortress at Tel El-Borg is one of a series of Egyptian military installations that line the northern Sinai route, a road that was heavily patrolled and controlled by Egyptian military forces throughout the New Kingdom period, making it, as the Book of Exodus suggests, a route that a large group of escaping slaves would have found extremely difficult to travel without interception. The significance of Tel El-Borg for the Exodus question is not that it proves the Exodus happened. It does not, and no single site could, but that it illuminates the geographical and military reality of the world in which the Exodus narrative is set. The northern Sinai route was exactly as the biblical text implies, heavily fortified, closely controlled, patrolled by Egyptian military forces who maintained a chain of fortresses along its length. A group leaving Egypt in the 2nd millennium BCE would have had strong practical reasons to avoid it. The southern routes through the Sinai, the routes that would take a large group through the wilderness rather than along the coast, were less controlled, less fortified, and more plausible as an escape route for people who needed to avoid Egyptian military attention. The inscriptions and artifacts from Tel El-Borg are housed in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo and in the collections of the Excavating Institution. They are military and administrative documents, the records of an imperial frontier maintained by soldiers who were doing the ordinary work of empire, guarding a road that had been guarded since the earliest dynasties. They did not know that the road they guarded would one day appear in one of the world's most read religious texts as the road that God steered his people away from. They were simply soldiers on a road, in a desert, doing their jobs. And the artifacts they left behind are the physical trace of a military reality that the biblical text, in its own way, accurately remembered. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre Foundation. In the heart of the old city of Jerusalem, in a building that has been constructed, destroyed, rebuilt, modified, and restored so many times across 17 centuries that its current form is a layered palimpsest of Byzantine, Crusader, medieval, and modern architecture, there stands the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the site that Christian tradition identifies as the location of the crucifixion and burial of Jesus of Nazareth, and therefore as the most sacred site in Christendom. The history of the building is long and complicated and fascinating in its own right. But beneath the building, in its foundations, and in the geological record of the site, There is archaeological evidence that has quietly transformed the scholarly understanding of the Church's relationship to the landscape of first-century Jerusalem. The site on which the Church of the Holy Sepulchre stands was identified as the location of the crucifixion and burial of Jesus by the Emperor Constantine in the early 4th century CE, on the basis of local Christian tradition and, according to the ancient sources, the discovery of a tomb beneath the floor of a Roman temple that had been built on the site by the Emperor Hadrian after the destruction of Jerusalem in 135 CE. Constantine demolished the Roman temple and built the first church of the Holy Sepulchre over the tomb that was found beneath it, which his contemporaries identified as the tomb of Jesus. For centuries, skeptics pointed out that the church site lay well within the walls of the ancient city of Jerusalem, and crucifixions were carried out outside city walls, as the Gospel accounts explicitly state, describing the crucifixion site as outside the city. If the church site was within the ancient city walls, how could it be the authentic location of the crucifixion? The answer came from archaeology. Excavations conducted within and beneath the church in the 20th century, and studies of the ancient topography of Jerusalem, established that the church site lay outside the city walls of first-century Jerusalem, outside the walls that stood in the time of Jesus, even though it lay within the walls of the later expanded city. The ancient quarry beneath the church, the tomb chambers carved into its rock, and the ceramic evidence from the site all indicate that the area was outside the city and used for burials in the 1st century CE, exactly consistent with its identification as the site of a crucifixion and burial outside the city walls. The foundation of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is the foundation of one of the most contested and most venerated sites in the world. The Rock of Golgotha, the outcropping of limestone that ancient pilgrims identified as the Hill of the Crucifixion, is still visible within the church, encased in glass and metal and the accumulated devotion of 17 centuries. The tomb chamber that Constantine's builders identified as the tomb of Christ was largely destroyed by a Fatimid caliph in 1009 CE, but the rock shelf into which it was carved still exists, and the rebuilt edicule, the small shrine that encloses it, was restored and cleaned in 2016 and 2017, revealing for the first time in centuries the original limestone surface of what may be the most visited square meter of rock in human history. The Amman Citadel Inscription. On the summit of the Amman Citadel, the great hill at the center of the modern Jordanian capital that has been inhabited continuously since the Bronze Age, and that was, in the biblical period, the royal city of the Ammonites, known as Rabbah or Rabbath Ammon. There is a small but significant inscription carved on a piece of limestone that was found in 1961 during construction work on the Citadel Hill. The inscription is in the Ammonite language, a Semitic language closely related to Hebrew and Moabite, and it dates to approximately the 9th century BC, making it the longest known Ammonite inscription ever found, and one of the most important epigraphic discoveries from the Transjordanian region. The Amman Citadel inscription is a building inscription. It records the construction of a building or sanctuary by an unidentified royal patron, and it includes references to the Ammonite god Milcom and to the divine blessing sought for the structure and its builders. The text is difficult in places. Ammonite is not well attested, and some words and forms are uncertain, but enough of it is clear to provide a valuable window into the language, the religious practice, and the royal ideology of the Ammonite kingdom that the biblical texts describe as one of Israel's most persistent neighbors and adversaries. The Ammonites appear throughout the biblical narrative, in the book of Judges, in the stories of Saul and David, in the books of Kings and Chronicles and Nehemiah. They are presented in the biblical texts as a people with whom Israel had a complex and frequently hostile relationship, sharing a border and a linguistic heritage while maintaining distinct national and religious identities. The Ammon Citadel inscription is a rare direct witness to that Ammonite identity, a text produced by the Ammonites themselves, in their own language, for their own purposes, giving their own account of their own religious and royal life. It is the Ammonite equivalent of the Mesha stele, the self-presentation of a neighboring people who appear in the biblical narrative primarily as adversaries, given a voice and a perspective of their own by the chance survival of a stone inscription on a citadel hill. The inscription is now housed in the Jordan Archaeological Museum in Amman, in the same institution that holds the copper scroll and many of the other extraordinary artifacts we have encountered on this journey. Amman, modern, busy, sprawling across its ancient hills, is built over one of the deepest and most continuous archaeological records in the ancient Near East, and the citadel at its center is a place where that depth is physically visible, Roman temple columns rising above Byzantine church foundations, rising above Iron Age royal buildings, rising above Bronze Age dwellings, layer upon layer of human habitation stacked in the soil of a hill that human beings have considered important enough to live on and build on and fight over for 5,000 years. The Megiddo Ivories Hidden Workshop. We have visited the Megiddo Ivories before, that extraordinary collection of carved ivory objects found in the ruins of the late Bronze Age palace, their sphinxes and lotus flowers and hunting scenes and royal figures speaking of a cosmopolitan artistic world that drew on Egyptian, Phoenician, and Mesopotamian traditions with equal facility. But recent scholarship has added a new dimension to our understanding of those ivories, one that shifts attention from the finished objects to the process by which they were made, and from the royal treasury, where they were found, to the workshop in which they were produced. Analysis of the Megiddo ivories conducted in recent decades has focused on the specific techniques used to produce them, the particular methods of carving, the specific tools marks visible under magnification, the ways in which individual pieces were joined and fitted. This analysis has revealed something that was not visible to the initial excavators, that a significant portion of the ivories were produced in a single workshop by craftsmen working in a consistent tradition, using a related set of tools and techniques. The ivories are not simply a collection of luxury imports from various sources. They are, at least in part, the product of a local or regional workshop tradition that was producing carved ivory objects at Megiddo or nearby during the Late Bronze Age. The identification of a workshop tradition, rather than a simple collection of imports, changes the picture of Megiddo's role in the ancient economy of the region. It suggests that Megiddo was not merely a consumer of luxury goods produced elsewhere, but a center of luxury production in its own right, a city with the skilled craftsmen, the supply chains for raw materials, and the royal or aristocratic patronage needed to sustain a workshop capable of producing objects of this quality and quantity. The same city that controlled the pass through the Carmel Ridge, the strategic bottleneck that made it, across 4,000 years of history, one of the most fought-over pieces of real estate in the ancient Near East, was also, in the Late Bronze Age, a center of artistic production sophisticated enough to create objects that still command admiration in the world's great museums. The ivories themselves do not change when we understand how they were made. The Sphinx still crouches with the same elegant economy of form. The woman's face still peers from its window with the same quality of arrested presence. But knowing that they emerged from a workshop, from the hands of craftsmen who practiced their art across years of training and daily work, who passed their techniques to apprentices, who produced object after object in a tradition that had developed over generations, adds a human dimension to their beauty that their status as museum objects can sometimes obscure. They are not only the products of royal wealth. They are the products of human skill, sustained and transmitted across time, as all skilled traditions are sustained and transmitted, through the patient work of hands that knew what they were doing and passed that knowledge on. The Wilderness of Zin Survey. We close this passage not with a single artifact but with a landscape, a vast and ancient and extraordinarily beautiful landscape that is itself a kind of artifact, shaped by human presence across thousands of years and preserving in its soil and its stone the evidence of those who have passed through it since the earliest periods of human prehistory. The Wilderness of Zin is the Hebrew name for a region of the central Negev Desert, the arid plateau and canyon country south and southeast of Beersheba, through which the Book of Numbers describes the Israelites passing during their wilderness wanderings, and in which the biblical text places several significant events: the death of Miriam, the death of Aaron, the striking of the rock at Meribah, the episode of the bronze serpent. It is a landscape of extraordinary geological drama. Deep wadis carved by intermittent floods into the soft chalk and limestone, circular craters called Makdashim that are unique geological formations found almost nowhere else in the world, sudden springs that burst from the rock in the middle of apparent desolation. Archaeological surveys conducted in the Negev over the past century have found evidence of human presence in the wilderness of Zin across every period from the Chalcolithic through the Byzantine and beyond. Campsites and pottery scatters, ancient caravan stations and water installations, rock inscriptions and cairns, and the remains of structures whose purposes are not always immediately clear. The landscape is not empty. It never has been. It has always been crossed and inhabited and worked in the margins and the seasonal camps and the desert routes by people who knew how to live in it and how to find in its apparent desolation the water and the pasture and the shelter that made life possible. The Nabatean road that crosses the wilderness of Zin, running from southward toward the Gulf of Aqaba along a route that was traveled for centuries by caravans carrying spices and incense and silks from Arabia to the Mediterranean, is still visible in places, its ancient paving stones still lying in the desert where the Nabatean engineers placed them 2,000 years ago. Beside the road, at intervals, are inscriptions carved into the soft sandstone by travelers who pass this way, names and prayers and greetings in Nabatean, Greek, and other scripts, the casual graffiti of the caravan road, left by merchants and pilgrims and soldiers who wanted to leave some mark of their passing in a landscape that might otherwise erase all trace of them. Those inscriptions, carved by people whose names we do not know, for reasons we can only partially reconstruct, in a landscape that has preserved them simply by being dry enough to prevent their erosion, are the final artifact of this passage. They are not grand. They are not famous. They are not housed in any museum. They are simply there, in the desert, in the sunlight, in the wind, as they have been since the hands that carved them withdrew. And they say, in the most fundamental possible way, what all of the artifacts we have visited in this long journey have said in their various ways. We were here. We passed through. We left something behind. Remember us. The Ain Dara Temple. In the rolling hills of northwestern Syria, not far from the modern city of Afrin, there stands on a basalt mound the remains of an Iron Age temple that has generated considerable excitement among scholars of the Hebrew Bible, not because it contains any inscription bearing a biblical name or any artifact with a direct textual connection to the biblical narrative, but because of something more immediate and more physically striking than any inscription could provide. Carved into the threshold of the temple's entrance and into the floor of its porch are a pair of enormous stone footprints, each one approximately a meter long, pressed into the basalt as though a being of colossal size had stepped across the threshold and into the sanctuary, leaving the mark of its passage in the stone for anyone who came after to see and to feel. The El Deir Alla temple was built sometime in the early 1st millennium BCE and remained in use for several centuries before being destroyed, probably by the Assyrian military expansion of the 8th century BCE. It is a large temple by the standards of the ancient Levant. Its main hall is approximately 30 meters long, and it is built on a raised platform approached by a broad stairway, surrounded by carved orthostats depicting lions and sphinxes and mythological creatures that stand guard along its outer walls with an imposing sculptural authority. The building plan, a long rectangular hall with a porch at one end, a main room in the middle, and an inner sanctuary at the far end, is strikingly similar to the plan of Solomon's temple as described in the first book of Kings, and the correspondence has been noted and discussed by biblical scholars since the temple was first excavated in the 1980s. But it is the footprints that stay with you. Two enormous prints at the threshold, where the divine being paused before entering. One enormous print at the entrance to the inner sanctuary, where it stepped inside. The theology behind those carved footprints is one that the Hebrew Bible also knows, the theology of a God who walks, who moves through space, who leaves the mark of divine presence in specific places and specific moments. The God who walked in the garden in the cool of the day. The God whose footsteps the psalmist seeks to trace. The God whose presence filled the temple with a cloud so thick that the priests could not stand to minister. The divine being who walked across the threshold of the El Deir Alla temple left its footprints in the stone 3,000 years ago, and they are still there, enormous, patient, and entirely real, in the basalt of a Syrian hillside, waiting for whoever comes to stand in them and feel, for a moment, the scale of what they were made to represent. The temple was damaged during the Syrian civil war. Satellite imagery from 2018 showed significant destruction to the site, including the loss of some of the carved orthostats and damage to the main structure. The footprints, as far as can be determined from available reports, survived. Stone is patient, and the things carved into it, even in a world of conflict and loss, have a way of enduring that gives them a particular kind of dignity. The dignity of things that have already outlasted everything that tried to destroy them, and that intend, quietly and without drama, to go on doing so. The Tel Rehov Beehives. In the Jordan Valley of northern Israel, at a large ancient mound called Tel Rehov, archaeologists excavating in the early years of the 21st century made a discovery that was, by any measure, unexpected. In a layer dating to approximately the 10th or 9th century BCE, the period of the early Israelite monarchy, they found the remains of an ancient apiary, a commercial beekeeping installation containing approximately 30 intact clay beehives, arranged in rows in a dedicated building, with evidence of the infrastructure needed to manage a large-scale honey production operation. It was the oldest apiary ever discovered in the ancient Near East, and one of the oldest ever found anywhere in the world. The beehives themselves are cylinders of unbaked clay, approximately 80 centimeters long and 40 centimeters in diameter, closed at one end and open at the other, stacked in rows 3 high in a mud brick building whose size suggests a significant commercial operation. Analysis of the remains found within and around the hives, pollen, beeswax, and the remains of bees themselves, preserved by the fire that destroyed the building and baked the clay hives hard enough to survive, revealed that the bees kept at Tel Rehov were not the local Levantine subspecies of honeybee, but a subspecies from Anatolia, in modern Turkey, a bee known for its docility and productivity that had evidently been imported specifically for commercial purposes. Someone at Tel Rehov in the 10th or 9th century BC was operating a sophisticated apiary using imported bees, producing honey on a commercial scale in a dedicated building with the infrastructure needed for professional beekeeping. The biblical description of the land of Canaan as a land flowing with milk and honey is one of the most familiar phrases in the entire biblical text, a shorthand for abundance and desirability that appears dozens of times in the Pentateuch and the historical books. The honey in that phrase has traditionally been interpreted by some scholars as referring to date honey or fig syrup rather than bee honey, on the grounds that commercial beekeeping was not well attested in the ancient Levant. The Tel Rehov apiary overturned that argument decisively. Bee honey was being produced commercially in the ancient Levant at the time of the early Israelite monarchy, on a scale that implies established beekeeping traditions and significant economic investment. The land flowing with honey was, in this very practical and very physical sense, exactly what the text describes, a land in which someone had taken the trouble to import better bees from Anatolia and set up 30 hives in a dedicated building in the Jordan Valley because the honey they produced was valuable enough to be worth the effort. The apiary at Tel Rehov was destroyed by fire sometime in the 9th century BC, possibly during the Assyrian campaigns that devastated the northern kingdom of Israel in this period. The fire that destroyed it baked the clay hives hard and preserved them, along with the pollen and the wax and the remains of the bees that had lived and died within them, across 28 centuries of silence. They are now studied in laboratories by archaeologists and paleobiologists and apiculturalists who can read in their clay, and their biological remains a detailed account of ancient beekeeping practice. And somewhere in the Jordan Valley, on the mound of Tel Rehov where the apiary once stood, the wild flowers that the imported Anatolian bees once visited still bloom in the spring, still filling the air above the ancient mound with the same fragrance that filled it 3,000 years ago, when the hives were full and the honey was flowing and the land was, in the most literal and most beautiful sense, exactly what it had always been called. The Gezur High Place Reconsidered. We have visited the standing stones of Gezur before, those 10 massive limestone monoliths arranged in a rough north-south line on the ancient mound, the best preserved example of a Canaanite high place ever discovered in the Levant, standing in the open air as they have stood for more than 3,000 years. But recent scholarship has added new dimensions to our understanding of what those stones meant and what rituals they may have hosted, and it is worth returning to them with the additional knowledge that the journey has given us. The both the standing stones, of Gezur were the subject of renewed scholarly attention in the early 21st century, when researchers applied new analytical techniques to the stones themselves and to the soil around their bases, seeking evidence of the specific rituals that had been conducted at the site. The results were partial and not conclusive, as results in archaeology so often are. The evidence that survives from 3,000 years of exposure and weathering and human activity at the site is fragmentary and ambiguous in ways that resist definitive interpretation. But certain things can be said with reasonable confidence. The stones were set in sockets cut into the bedrock, a construction technique that implies deliberate planning and significant labor that tells us the installation of the stones was a considered act rather than a casual one. The orientation of the stone row, north to south, may reflect astronomical or liturgical concerns. The largest stone, nearly 3 meters tall, stands near the center of the row and may have been the primary focus of ritual attention. And a large basin carved from stone, found near the bases of the stones, may have served for the collection of liquids, water, wine, oil, used in the rituals that the stones presided over. The biblical texts describe the high places and their standing stones with a consistent negativity. They are condemned as sites of illegitimate worship, associated with Canaanite religious practice, repeatedly destroyed and repeatedly rebuilt in the long struggle between the prophetic demand for centralized, pure worship and the popular attachment to local sacred sites that had been considered holy for generations. The Gezer high place predates the Israelite presence at the site. It is Canaanite in origin, but the biblical texts suggest that Israelite communities continued to use similar installations long after the conquest period, finding in the local high place with its standing stones a form of religious experience that the Jerusalem temple, however magnificent, could not entirely replace. The stones at Gezer are a monument to that persistence, to the human need for local sacred space, for the divine presence made tangible and specific and close, for a place that has always been holy and that the weight of the stones themselves seems to guarantee will always remain so. The Wadi Daliya Papyri. In a cave in the cliffs above the Wadi Daliya, a deep canyon that cuts through the desert west of the Jordan River, north of Jericho, archaeologists and Bedouin working in the 1960s found a collection of papyrus documents and associated artifacts that told a story of flight and tragedy from the 4th century BCE. The documents were discovered together with the skeletal remains of approximately 200 people, men, women, and children, who had taken refuge in the cave and had died there, apparently sealed in by their pursuers and left to suffocate or starve in the darkness of the cave. The Wadi Daliya papyri are legal documents from Samaria, the capital of the Samaritan region, dating to the 4th century BCE during the period of Persian rule over the Levant. They are contracts, deeds of sale, and legal agreements of various kinds, written in Aramaic and sealed with clay bully bearing the impressions of the parties to the agreements. They record the ordinary transactions of the Samaritan elite in the final decades of Persian rule, the buying and selling of slaves, the transfer of property, the legal formalities of a society organized around written contracts and authenticated by personal seals. The people who carried these documents into the cave were almost certainly Samaritans fleeing a catastrophe, most likely the punitive expedition sent by Alexander the Great against Samaria in 332 BCE, after the Samaritans killed his governor. Alexander's response to the killing was swift and severe, and it appears that members of the Samaritan aristocracy fled into the desert with their most valuable possessions, including their legal documents, which represented their property rights and their social status, and took refuge in the cave, where they were found and trapped and died. The documents they carried were found beside their bones, the last things they held, the papers that recorded their place in a world that was ending around them. The Wadi Daliya papyri are now divided between the collections of the Rockefeller Museum in Jerusalem and the American Schools of Oriental Research. The bully that sealed them, small clay impressions bearing the images of gods and mythological figures and geometric designs, have been studied intensively and have contributed significantly to our knowledge of the artistic and religious culture of Samaritan society in the Persian period. The people who pressed those seals into the clay of their contracts, who carried those documents into a cave in the desert, who died in the dark with their papers beside them, they are known to us now only through those papers, through the legal formalities of a society that recorded its transactions in ink on papyrus and sealed them with clay. Their names appear in the documents. their faces do not. But the weight of their final hours is present in the cave where they died, and in the documents they carried with them, and in the bones that were found beside those documents when the cave was opened 23 centuries after it was sealed. The inscribed altar of Dan. At the ancient site of Tel Dan, the northernmost of the great Israelite sacred sites, the city at the headwaters of the Jordan where the tribe of Dan established a sanctuary that the Book of Judges describes and that the Book of Kings condemns as one of the two great sins of Jeroboam, archaeologists have found, over decades of excavation, a remarkable concentration of evidence for the religious life of the ancient Israelite North. The site is beautiful in itself. A large natural spring emerges from beneath the Tel in a rushing torrent of clear water that has been flowing since the beginning of human memory, surrounded by trees and greenery in the midst of the Hula Valley. To stand at the Spring of Dan is to understand immediately why human beings have been gathering at this place since the Neolithic period. Among the finds from the sacred precinct at Tel Dan, the area associated with a sanctuary that Jeroboam established there in the 10th century BCE and that continued in use through the Assyrian destruction of the northern kingdom in 722 BCE, is an inscribed altar stone that bears one of the most significant epigraphic discoveries from the site. The inscription is brief and partially damaged, but it contains elements that connect the altar to the official cult apparatus of the Northern Kingdom, the royal sanctuary that the biblical texts describe as a rival to the Jerusalem Temple, established by Jeroboam as an alternative pilgrimage site for the northern tribes. The altar and its inscriptions speak of the intensity of the ancient Israelite relationship with specific sacred sites, the conviction that certain places were intrinsically holy, that the divine presence attached itself to particular locations with a specificity that made those locations irreplaceable. The Spring of Dan, with its rushing water and its ancient trees, has the quality of a place that has always felt sacred, that would have felt sacred to any human being who came upon it in any century, before any religious tradition had claimed it or named it or built a sanctuary on the mound above it. The sanctuary at Dan was built in a place that was already holy by virtue of what it was, and the kings who built there and the priests who served there and the pilgrims who came there were all responding to something in the landscape itself, as much as to the theological claims that had been made on behalf of the site. The spring still flows. The water is still cold and clear and abundant, emerging from the limestone of the anti-Lebanon mountains through channels that have carried it to this place since long before human beings arrived to drink from it. The Tel above the spring still contains the layers of human occupation, still yielding its evidence to the careful work of excavation. And the inscribed altar stone still sits in the stores of the Israel Antiquities Authority, its letters still bearing witness to a cult and a kingdom and a sacred site that the biblical texts remember with a mixture of condemnation and, beneath the condemnation, the unmistakable trace of something that mattered enormously to the people who gathered there. The Petra Scrolls. In the spring of 1993, a fire broke out in a storage room adjacent to the Byzantine church that had been discovered at Petra, the great Nabatean city carved from rose-red sandstone in the mountains of southern Jordan, one of the most spectacular archaeological sites in the world. The fire was a catastrophe for the objects stored in that room, but it was also, in the paradoxical way that disasters sometimes operate in archaeology, a revelation. When the firefighters and archaeologists cleared the debris after the fire was extinguished, they found that the heat of the blaze had carbonized a collection of papyrus scrolls that had been stored in the room, turning them black but also, crucially, preserving them in a form that was stable enough to be carefully separated and eventually read. The Petra Scrolls, as they came to be called, are a collection of approximately 140 papyrus documents, written in Greek and dating to the 6th century CE, that record the legal and financial affairs of a family of Christian landowners from the Petra region across several generations. They are wills, contracts, tax records, property divisions, and correspondence, the documentary archive of a moderately prosperous Byzantine family navigating the legal and economic systems of the late antique world. They mention Petra by name, providing direct documentary evidence for the city's continued occupation and administration in the Byzantine period, after the decline of the Nabatean kingdom and the incorporation of the region into the Roman and then Byzantine empires. The scrolls are being studied and published by an international team of scholars, and their publication is ongoing. The process of separating, photographing, and reading carbonized papyri is extraordinarily delicate and time-consuming, and the project has taken decades. What has been published so far reveals a world of considerable legal and administrative sophistication in Byzantine Petra, a world of property rights and inheritance disputes and tax obligations and family arrangements that has the texture of real life in all its complexity and particularity. The family whose archive these scrolls represent, the family of Theodoros, son of Abodianos, and his descendants, were real people, living real lives, worrying about real problems of property and inheritance and tax and family obligation, in a city whose rose-red cliffs were already ancient when they were born, and that would outlast them by many centuries. The scrolls are housed at the American Center of Oriental Research in Amman and at the Jordan Archaeological Museum. The Byzantine Church at Petra, a beautiful building with mosaic floors depicting personifications of the seasons and the ocean and the earth, has been partially restored and is open to visitors. The storage room where the scrolls were found is a small, unprepossessing space adjacent to the main building, the kind of room that in any living building would be used for storing cleaning supplies or extra furniture, unremarkable in every way except for what was found in it when the fire cleared. The ordinary and the extraordinary are always closer together in the ancient world than they appear. The most significant discoveries often come from the most prosaic places: the storeroom, the cistern lining the drainage channel, the construction trench. The ancient world did not arrange itself for the convenience of archaeologists. It simply lived and left behind what it left behind, in whatever form and in whatever location the accidents of history determined. And the accidents of history, it turns out, have been extraordinarily generous. The Megiddo Water System Revisited. We have visited the water systems of several ancient cities on this journey: the Siloam Tunnel of Jerusalem, the Warren's Shaft Complex, the Gezer Water System, and each of them has illuminated something different about the ancient engineering ingenuity that kept cities alive in a landscape where water was precious and sieges were a perpetual reality. The water system at Megiddo deserves its own extended consideration, both for what it achieved technically and for what it reveals about the administrative and organizational capacity of the ancient Israelite city at its height. The Megiddo water system was carved through the limestone bedrock beneath the city in the Iron Age, probably in the 9th century BCE, the same general period as the Siloam Tunnel at Jerusalem, suggesting that the provision of secure water was a priority across multiple Israelite cities in this period. The system at Megiddo is more complex and more ambitious than the Jerusalem Tunnel in certain respects. It begins with a large rectangular shaft, approximately 12 meters square and nearly 30 meters deep, cut vertically through the accumulated layers of the Tel all the way to the bedrock. From the bottom of the shaft, A horizontal tunnel runs approximately 80 meters through the bedrock to a spring that had previously been accessible only from outside the city walls. At the point where the tunnel reached the spring, the external opening was concealed, blocked, and disguised so that anyone approaching the city from outside would not know that the spring was connected to the city by a hidden tunnel. The engineering achievement represented by the Megiddo water system is impressive by any standard. The shaft alone, 12 meters square and nearly 30 meters deep, cut through the accumulated debris of millennia of occupation, required the removal of an enormous volume of material, organized and coordinated in a way that speaks of central planning and administrative authority capable of mobilizing large numbers of workers for a sustained engineering project. The tunnel required precise direction keeping through solid rock in an era before modern surveying equipment, using techniques of alignment that are not fully understood, but that produced a tunnel accurate enough to reach its target. And the concealment of the external spring opening required both the foresight to plan it and the authority to ensure it was done and maintained. The water system at Megiddo is one of the clearest physical demonstrations available of the organizational capacity of the ancient Israelite city-state at its height, of the existence of an administrative apparatus capable of planning, funding, and executing a large-scale engineering project of this complexity. It is evidence, in stone and in the absence of stone where the stone was removed, of a society with the surplus resources, the technical knowledge, and the centralized authority to undertake works of public infrastructure that went far beyond the needs of daily life into the realm of strategic long-term planning. The city that built this water system was a city that expected to be here for a long time, that was planning for the worst while living in the best, that was thinking about the future with the methodical confidence of an administrative tradition that knew what it was doing and had the means to do it. The Cave of Letters artifacts. In the same Judean desert cliffs that yielded the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Nahal Mishmar treasure, in a cave accessible only by rappelling down a sheer cliff face above a dry streambed in the nature reserve of Nahal Hever, archaeologists working under Yigal Yadin in the 1960s found evidence of one of the most poignant episodes in the history of the Jewish people, the final refuge of survivors of the Bar Kokhba revolt, the last great Jewish uprising against Roman rule, which ended in catastrophic defeat in 135 CE. The cave, known as the Cave of Letters for the documents found within it, contained the personal archive of a woman named Baba, the daughter of Shimon, who had fled the advancing Roman forces with her family documents and her most valued possessions and had taken refuge in the cave, where she died, as did the other refugees who sheltered there. Babatha's archive consists of 35 documents spanning the years 94 to 132 CE, written in Aramaic, Nabatean, and Greek, and recording the legal and financial affairs of a prosperous Jewish family in the En-Gedi region of the Dead Sea. The documents included deed of gift, marriage contracts, property records, and most significantly, a series of legal documents relating to a custody dispute over Babatha's son from her first marriage, a dispute she was pursuing through the Roman courts at the time of the revolt. What is extraordinary about Babatha's archive is the intimacy of its testimony. These are not royal documents or religious texts or official administrative records. They are the private papers of a private person, a woman of the early 2nd century CE navigating the legal systems of her world, managing property, pursuing a custody case, trying to secure the rights and future of her child. She carried these documents with her into the cave because they represented her legal identity and her family's claims, because they were the documentary foundation of everything she had built and everything she hoped to secure. And she died with them, in the dark of the cave, as the Roman army consolidated its victory in the world outside. The documents were found still wrapped in their original covers, still tied with the cords that Baba had used to bundle them, still in the leather pouch in which she had carried them. The personal objects found with them, keys to her house in En-Gedi, a mirror, wooden objects, textiles, speak of a life interrupted mid-course, of a woman who had expected to go home and who never did. Her keys are among the most moving objects in the Israel Museum's collection. Ordinary house keys, made of iron, still functional in principle, carried into a desert cave by a woman who intended to return to the house they unlocked and who left them there instead, in the dark, for 19 centuries, until the archaeologist's hand reached in and brought them back into the light. The Qumran Scriptorium. At the site of Qumran, the community on the northwestern shore of the Dead Sea that is associated with the Dead Sea Scrolls, the community that lived there in the final centuries BCE and the 1st century CE, and whose library of sacred texts has occupied us at several points in this journey, archaeologists excavating in the 1950s found, in the ruins of the main building complex, a room that has been identified as a scriptorium, the room in which the community's scribes sat and worked, copying and producing the texts that were eventually stored in the caves nearby. The identification of the room as a scriptorium rests on the discovery within it of 2 long, narrow plaster tables, low writing tables, approximately 5 meters long, at which scribes would have sat cross-legged on the floor in the manner of ancient Near Eastern scribes, and an inkwell, still containing traces of dried ink, that was found in the debris of the room. The tables are reconstructed and displayed in the Rockefeller Museum in Jerusalem, and they are among the most evocative objects in the entire corpus of Dead Sea Scroll archaeology, physical furniture from the room where the scrolls were made, the surfaces on which the parchment was laid as the scribes worked, still bearing the shape of the work that was done on them 2,000 years ago. The Qumran Scriptorium, if that is indeed what it was, and some scholars have proposed alternative identifications for the room, was the factory of one of the most significant literary productions of the ancient world. The community at Qumran was not simply preserving texts that already existed. It was producing texts, copying biblical manuscripts, composing its own sectarian documents, creating a library that reflected its particular theological vision and its particular understanding of history and prophecy and the approaching end of the age. The scribes who sat at those long tables, dipping their reed pens into the inkwell and pressing the letters of the Hebrew alphabet onto carefully prepared parchment, were not merely copyists. They were participants in a living intellectual and religious tradition, making decisions about what to copy and how to copy it, contributing to a corpus of texts that would, 2,000 years later, transform our understanding of the Jewish world in which Christianity was born. The inkwell found in the scriptorium is a small ceramic vessel, plain, functional, entirely unremarkable in its manufacture. It is the kind of object that would have been produced by the thousands in any ancient pottery workshop, bought cheaply, used until it was empty, replaced without ceremony. And yet this particular inkwell, in this particular room, at this particular site, is one of the most significant small objects in the history of biblical scholarship. The ink that dried in it was the ink that went onto the parchment of the Dead Sea Scrolls. The hand that dipped a reed pen into it was the hand that wrote words that have been read by millions of people across 2,000 years of scholarship and devotion. The connection between the inkwell and the scrolls is direct and physical and entirely real. And sitting with that connection, with the thought that the ink in that small ceramic vessel became the letters on the great Isaiah scroll, became the community rule, became the Thanksgiving hymns, is one of the quieter and more extraordinary experiences that the ancient world has to offer. The Eternal Cities, Jewish Catacombs. Beneath the streets of Rome, beneath the modern city, beneath the medieval city, beneath the ancient city that was already ancient when the first Jewish communities established themselves within it, there are tunnels. Miles and miles of tunnels, carved through the soft volcanic rock called tufa by the communities of the dead, who used them as burial places across the centuries of the Roman Empire and beyond. The Christian catacombs of Rome are the most famous. The catacombs of Calixtus and Sebastian and Domitilla, visited by millions of tourists and pilgrims each year, their walls bearing the earliest surviving examples of Christian art. But there are also Jewish catacombs beneath Rome, less visited and less famous, that speak of a Jewish community in Rome whose history reaches back to the 2nd century BCE and whose members lived and died and were buried in one of the great cities of the ancient world across 5 centuries of continuous presence. The Jewish catacombs of Rome, at Villa Torlonia, at Vigna Randonini, at Monteverdi, contain hundreds of burial niches carved from the tufa, many of them marked with inscriptions in Greek, Latin, Hebrew, and Aramaic that identify the dead and sometimes tell something of their lives. The inscriptions record names, many of them familiar Hebrew names rendered into Greek or Latin, names like Maria and Ioses and Esther and Samuel, names that appear in the pages of the New Testament and the Hebrew Bible, names that were being given to Jewish children in Rome in the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd centuries CE. They record titles, archysynagogos, father of the synagogue, scribe, elder, that illuminate the organizational structure of the Roman Jewish community. And they record, in their formulaic farewells, something of the hope and the resignation and the faith with which the community faced the death of its members. The walls of the Jewish catacombs are decorated with painted images, menorahs and etrogs and lulavs, the ram's horn shofar, the Torah ark, and alongside these Jewish symbols, representations drawn from the broader decorative vocabulary of Roman painting, birds and flowers and geometric patterns that speak of a community fully embedded in the visual culture of the city it lived in, using the same decorative language as its neighbors while maintaining the specific symbols of its own identity. The same creative adaptation that we saw in the mosaic floors of the Galilean synagogues is visible here, in the painted walls of the Roman Jewish catacombs, a community that was simultaneously deeply Roman and deeply Jewish, that moved between those identities with a fluency that the categories of later centuries sometimes make difficult to appreciate. The catacomb at Villa Torlonia was rediscovered in 1919 after having been known in the 16th century and then lost again. The catacomb at Vigna Randonini has been known since the 19th century. Both are fragile and not open to general public access. The tufa is soft, the paintings are vulnerable to humidity and air movement, and the preservation of what remains requires careful management. But the community that carved those tunnels and painted those walls and buried its dead there with inscriptions in 4 languages is not forgotten. It is present in every inscription, every painted menorah, every Greek name over a Jewish burial niche, present in the particular and irreducible specificity of individual lives, lived in a great city, in a great empire, in a great and complicated world, and commemorated in the dark beneath the streets with a simple and enduring human insistence that these people were here, that they mattered, that their names should be known. The Khirbet Kiafar inscription. On a hilltop overlooking the Elah Valley, the same valley where, according to the first book of Samuel, The young David stood with his sling and faced the Philistine giant Goliath across a narrow strip of contested ground. Archaeologists excavating a fortified site called Khirbet Qeiyafa in the late 2000s made a discovery that sent a ripple of excitement through the world of biblical scholarship. It was not a dramatic monument or a royal inscription. It was a pottery sherd, broken from the shoulder of a storage jar, bearing 5 lines of ink text in an early alphabetic script. But the sherd's date, approximately the late 11th or early 10th century BC, the period of the early Israelite monarchy, the time of Saul and David, and its location in a fortified city at the boundary between Israelite and Philistine territory gave it a significance that its modest size did not immediately suggest. The Khirbet Qeiyafa ostracon, as it came to be known, is one of the earliest known examples of alphabetic writing found in the context of a site associated with the early Israelite period, and its discovery prompted intense debate about the language in which it was written, whether it was Hebrew, Phoenician, or another related Canaanite dialect, and about what it actually said. The text has been read in multiple ways by multiple scholars, and no single interpretation has achieved consensus. Some have read it as containing words related to social justice. Do not oppress the widow. Do not oppress the stranger. Do not oppress the orphan. Language that resonates with the prophetic tradition of the Hebrew Bible. Others have proposed different readings entirely. The inscription is short, the script is early and not always clearly formed, and the words are separated from each other by dots rather than spaces, in the manner of some early inscriptions, which adds to the difficulty of reading. What the ostracon demonstrates, regardless of its specific reading, is that alphabetic writing was being practiced at a fortified site in the Elah Valley in the early 10th century BC, in the period and the region associated with the early Israelite monarchy. The site itself, Khirbet Qeiyafa, has produced evidence of a fortified city of considerable size, with a gate complex, a palace building, and a city plan that speaks of central planning and administrative authority. Its destruction in the early 10th century BC left a layer of burned material that has yielded a rich collection of artifacts, pottery, bronze objects, stone weights, and animal bones from sacrificial meals, that together paint a detailed picture of a community living and working and worshiping at a strategic frontier site in the formative period of Israelite history. The Elah Valley below the site is still there, still a broad, fertile valley running east from the Shephelah toward the hill country, still crossed by the seasonal stream where David is said to have chosen 5 smooth stones from the brook. The hilltop of Khirbet Qeiyafa commands a view of that valley that makes immediately clear why someone chose to build a fortified city there. Who held the hill controlled the valley, and who controlled the valley controlled the road that led from the coastal plain into the heart of the Judean hill country. The person who wrote those 5 lines of ink on that pottery sherd, in the early morning or the late afternoon of a day 3,000 years ago, wrote them in a place that mattered, a place on the edge of 2 worlds, looking out over a valley where history was being made. The Saqqara Papyrus. In the ancient necropolis of Saqqara, the vast burial ground on the desert plateau west of Memphis, where the great stepped pyramid of Djoser rises from the sand in the oldest monumental stone structure ever built by human hands, there have been found, across centuries of excavation, papyrus documents of every kind and period that illuminate the long history of Egypt and its connections to the wider ancient world. Among the most historically significant of these is a document that came to light in the late 20th century and that speaks directly to the political world described in the final chapters of the book of Jeremiah. The Saqqara Papyrus, sometimes called the Adon letter, is a letter written in Aramaic dating to approximately 600 BCE from a king named Adon to the Egyptian pharaoh, appealing for Egyptian military assistance against the advancing Babylonian army of Nebuchadnezzar. The king identifies himself as a ruler of a city in the Philistine or Phoenician coastal region. The identification of his specific city is debated, with Ekron and Ashkelon and several other sites having been proposed, and he describes in urgent terms the approach of the Babylonian forces and the desperate need for Egyptian intervention before his city falls. The letter was never answered, or if it was, the answer has not survived. What survived is the appeal itself, written on papyrus in the Aramaic of the period, bearing the seal impression of the king who sent it and the formulaic structure of ancient Near Eastern royal correspondence. It is a letter that was received in Egypt, filed in an archive at Saqqara, and forgotten for 2,500 years before being found by archaeologists and recognized for what it was, a contemporary document from the exact moment described in the book of Jeremiah, when the Babylonian advance was sweeping through the small kingdoms of the Levantine coast and destroying, one by one, the political structures of the pre-exilic world. The book of Jeremiah is deeply concerned with the question of Egyptian military assistance. Jeremiah consistently and forcefully warned against relying on Egypt for protection against Babylon, insisting that such reliance was both politically futile and theologically faithless, a turning away from God toward a broken reed that would pierce the hand of any who leaned on it. The kings and officials who appear in the book of Jeremiah debating whether to appeal to Egypt, whether Egyptian forces would come, whether the Babylonian advance could be stopped by Egyptian intervention, they were having the same conversation that the author of the Saqqara papyrus was having when he dipped his pen in ink and wrote his urgent appeal to the pharaoh. The conversation appears in the biblical text as a theological drama. The papyrus shows it as a political emergency, as the desperate act of a small king facing annihilation, reaching out across the sand toward a great power that did not, in the end, save him. The Beth Shean Stele. In the ancient city of Beth Shean, one of the most strategically important cities in the ancient Levant, sitting at the junction of the Jordan Valley and the Jezreel Valley in a position that controlled the crossing point between the northern and southern regions of the land. Egyptian pharaohs of the New Kingdom period erected a series of commemorative stelae that have survived in remarkable condition and that illuminate the Egyptian military presence in Canaan during the period most relevant to the biblical narratives of the Late Bronze Age and the transition to the Iron Age. Beth Shean was an Egyptian administrative center during the New Kingdom period, garrisoned by Egyptian troops and governed by Egyptian officials, and the stelae found there, several of which are now in the collections of the University of Pennsylvania Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology in Philadelphia and the Rockefeller Museum in Jerusalem, bear the names and images of the pharaohs Seti I and Ramesses II, and record their military campaigns in Canaan with the conventional language of Egyptian royal self-presentation. They describe battles against Canaanite city-states, the suppression of rebellions, the reassertion of Egyptian control over the trade routes and agricultural regions of the land, and they do so in the hieroglyphic script and the artistic conventions of the New Kingdom royal inscription tradition, which presents the pharaoh as an invincible divine warrior whose victories are predetermined by the gods. The city of Beth Shean appears in the biblical narrative in a context that gives its Egyptian stele a particular resonance. The first book of Samuel describes how, after the Philistines defeated the Israelites at the Battle of Jezreel and killed Saul and his sons, they fastened the bodies of Saul and his sons to the walls of Beth Shean, displaying their enemies' corpses as a public declaration of victory, in the manner that the ancient Near East understood as the ultimate statement of military dominance. The same city where Egyptian pharaohs had erected their victory stele became the setting for the humiliation of the first Israelite king, his body hanging on the walls of a city that had been an Egyptian garrison town for centuries. The men of Jabesh Gilead retrieved Saul's body in the night, the text tells us, traveling through the dark to take down what the Philistines had put up, to give proper burial to a king who deserved better than to hang on the walls of Bethshean. The stele that the pharaohs erected there, proud, hieroglyphic, announcing Egyptian power in the most permanent form available to the ancient world, have outlasted the Egyptian presence at the site and the Philistine presence and the Israelite presence and every subsequent occupation of the Tel, which continued through the Hellenistic and Roman periods and into the Byzantine era. They endure in their museum cases in Philadelphia and Jerusalem, their hieroglyphs still sharp, their images of the divine pharaoh still carrying the authority with which they were invested 3,000 years ago. And the walls of Bethshean, where Saul's body hung in the night, are still there in the soil of the Tel, still holding the shape of that ancient city, still containing in their stones the memory of everything that happened within and against them across the long centuries of their existence. The awful Pithos inscription. In the same awful excavations that yielded the early alphabetic inscription we visited earlier in this final passage, the ongoing excavations just south of the Temple Mount directed in recent years by Eilat Mazar, there came to light in 2012 another inscribed object that attracted significant scholarly attention. It was a large storage jar, a pithos, bearing an inscription scratched into its clay surface before firing, in a script that proved to be neither Hebrew nor Phoenician nor any of the other alphabetic scripts of the ancient Levant. It was, the scholars who studied it determined, a previously unknown script, or rather, a script so early in the development of the Canaanite alphabetic tradition that it predated the differentiation of the regional scripts that scholars had previously catalogued. The awful Pithos inscription dates to approximately the 10th century BCE, the same general period as the Khirbet Kiafa Ostracon, and it was found in a context associated with the administrative buildings of the early Israelite period at Jerusalem. The inscription is short, only a few characters, and its reading and interpretation are disputed, as is so often the case with early alphabetic inscriptions whose script is poorly attested. But its presence at Jerusalem, at this period, in this context, adds another data point to the accumulating picture of literacy and administrative activity in the early Israelite capital. What the Pithos inscription illustrates, beyond its specific content, which remains uncertain, is the vitality and the geographical spread of alphabetic writing in the early Iron Age Levant. Alphabetic inscriptions from this period have been found at sites from the northern Syrian coast to the Negev Desert, in a variety of scripts that are all clearly related to each other and all clearly descended from the Proto-Sinaitic or Proto-Canaanite alphabetic tradition that emerged in the 2nd millennium BC. The alphabet was spreading, being adopted and adapted by different communities across the region, each developing its own distinctive letter forms and conventions while maintaining the fundamental alphabetic principle that had made the system so flexible and so powerful in the first place. Jerusalem in the 10th century BC was part of that spreading alphabetic world, a city where storage jars were inscribed and administrative records were kept, and the technology of writing was woven into the fabric of daily administrative and commercial life. The Pithos inscription is a small piece of evidence for a large and important historical process, the process by which the written word became the medium through which the ancient Near Eastern world organized its affairs and eventually preserved its memory. the Caesarea Maritima harbor. On the Mediterranean coast of Israel, where the ancient shoreline curves between the modern cities of Haifa and Tel Aviv, there lies beneath the shallow waters of the sea one of the most remarkable feats of ancient engineering in the entire ancient world, the submerged harbor of Caesarea Maritima. The great port city built by Herod the Great between approximately 22 and 10 BCE and named in honor of his Roman patron, the Emperor Augustus Caesar. The harbor of Caesarea Maritima was an extraordinary achievement. The site offered no natural harbor. It was an exposed stretch of coastline with no bay or inlet to provide shelter from the prevailing winds and waves. Herod built his harbor from nothing, creating an entirely artificial protected anchorage by constructing two massive breakwaters of hydraulic concrete, a Roman building material made by mixing volcanic ash with seawater and lime, that extended hundreds of meters into the sea. The northern breakwater alone was approximately 200 meters wide and extended nearly 500 meters into the sea. The concrete was poured in enormous timber forms submerged in the water, where it hardened into blocks of extraordinary size and strength that have survived, partially submerged and partially collapsed, for 2,000 years beneath the Mediterranean. The harbor at Caesarea Maritima was the gateway through which Roman culture, Roman goods, Roman people, and Roman authority entered the province of Judea. It was the port through which the Apostle Paul sailed on his journeys. The Acts of the Apostles describes Paul arriving at and departing from Caesarea Maritima on multiple occasions, and describes him being held there as a prisoner for 2 years before his final journey to Rome. It was the port through which the Roman army arrived and departed, the port through which the goods of Judea flowed outward to the Mediterranean world, and the goods of the Mediterranean world flowed inward to the markets and storehouses of the province. The harbor was the interface between the biblical world and the wider Roman world, the physical threshold through which that connection was maintained and through which the events described in the Acts of the Apostles were made possible. Underwater archaeological surveys of the Caesarea harbor, conducted since the 1970s, have mapped the remains of the breakwaters and the harbor installations in remarkable detail. The warehouses and quays and lighthouse platform visible beneath the shallow water, the great concrete blocks of the breakwaters lying where the sea eventually pulled them down, the anchors and pottery and amphoras scattered across the harbor floor. The city above the harbor, excavated over decades of work by teams from multiple countries, has yielded the pilot stone and the theater and the hippodrome and the vaults of the Herodian harbor warehouses and 1,000 other artifacts and structures that together reconstruct one of the most cosmopolitan cities of the ancient world. The harbor itself lies beneath the sea, patient and enormous and slowly crumbling, still the largest structure that Herod the Great ever built, still speaking of the ambition and the engineering genius and the enormous resources of the man who built it from nothing on an inhospitable stretch of the Mediterranean coast. The Samaria Ostraca. In the ruins of the royal palace of Samaria, the capital of the northern kingdom of Israel, the city built by Omri and developed by Ahab, the city whose ivory decorations the prophet Amos condemned and whose fall to the Assyrians in 722 BC the Book of Kings records with the measured sorrow of a historian recording a catastrophe, archaeologists working in the early 20th century found, in addition to the ivories we have already visited, a collection of pottery sherds bearing ink. Inscriptions that are among the most important administrative documents to survive from the ancient Israelite period. The Samaria Ostraca are a collection of approximately 63 inscribed sherds. The number varies slightly depending on how fragments are counted, that date to the first half of the 8th century BC. the reigns of Jeroboam II and possibly his predecessors. They are administrative records, receipts or delivery notes recording shipments of wine and olive oil sent to the royal palace at Samaria from various agricultural estates in the surrounding region. They record the names of the estates from which the shipments came, the names of the individuals who sent or received them, the regnal years in which they were received, and the commodities, old wine, fine oil, that they contained. The Samaria ostraca are significant for several reasons. They provide direct evidence for the administrative system of the Northern Kingdom at its height, the systematic record-keeping, the organized collection of agricultural produce from royal estates, the professional scribal tradition that produced legible and consistent administrative documents. They contain personal names that illuminate the religious landscape of the period, names compounded with the divine name Yahweh, and names compounded with the name Baal, existing side by side in the same administrative documents, suggesting that the worship of Baal in the Northern Kingdom was not merely the aberration of a small elite, but was sufficiently widespread to appear routinely in the personal names of ordinary administrators. They mention place names and clan names that can be correlated with the geographical and tribal information in the biblical texts, providing a detailed map of the administrative geography of the Northern Kingdom in the 8th century BC. And they speak, in their terseness and their practicality, of a world of agricultural abundance that the prophets of the period describe from a very different angle, the same wine and oil that Amos condemns the wealthy for drinking while the poor are trampled appear in the Samaria ostraca as administrative commodities, flowing into the royal palace in measured quantities, recorded by professional scribes in a bureaucratic system of considerable efficiency. The prophetic rage and the administrative record are looking at the same world from opposite ends of the social spectrum, and together they produce a picture of the Northern Kingdom at its height that is richer and more complicated and more human than either source alone could provide. The Tomb of the Shroud. In the summer of 2000, construction work in a neighborhood of Jerusalem called Akeldama, a site associated in the Book of Acts with the death of Judas Iscariot and used as a burial ground since the Second Temple period, uncovered an ancient tomb that had been sealed and undisturbed for nearly 2,000 years. Archaeologists from the Hebrew University, called in to excavate the site before the construction continued, found within the tomb the remains of a man who had died in the 1st century CE, wrapped in a burial shroud of extraordinary preservation, the oldest Jewish burial shroud ever found, its textile structure intact after 2 millennia in the sealed tomb. The shroud from the Akeldama tomb is significant for what it reveals about Jewish burial practice in 1st century Jerusalem, the period of the New Testament, the period in which the Gospels describe the burial of Jesus in a linen shroud in a rock-cut tomb. The shroud from Akeldama is a simple linen and wool textile, without the elaborate weaving pattern of the Shroud of Turin, woven in a 2/2 twill technique that is consistent with 1st century Jewish textile production. The man buried in it was identified through analysis of his bones, and the material found with him as someone who had suffered from tuberculosis and possibly leprosy, diseases that would have made him ritually impure during his lifetime, and whose burial in a rock-cut tomb suggests that despite his illness, he was a person of sufficient social standing to merit the kind of burial associated with the Jewish elite of the period. The discovery of the Akeldama shroud provided scholars with a direct comparison for the Shroud of Turin, and the comparison was illuminating. The weave of the Akeldama shroud is different from the herringbone weave of the Turin shroud, which some textile experts have argued is inconsistent with 1st century Jewish textile production. The Akeldama shroud, by contrast, is woven in a pattern consistent with what we know of first-century textiles from other sites. The comparison does not prove or disprove the authenticity of the Turin shroud. It adds a data point to a discussion that will continue to generate scholarly and popular debate for the foreseeable future. But it gives us something invaluable, a real first-century Jewish burial shroud, from a real first-century Jewish tomb, in first-century Jerusalem, preserving the physical evidence of how the dead were wrapped and laid to rest in the world that the New Testament describes. The tomb at Akeldama was resealed after excavation, its contents documented and studied and published. The neighborhood around it continues to develop, the city of Jerusalem continues to grow and change, and the ancient burial ground of Akeldama, the field of blood, as the Book of Acts calls it, lies beneath the modern landscape, its tomb still in the rock, its dead still in the earth, still holding in the fabric of ancient textile and the chemistry of ancient bone the physical testimony of lives lived and ended in the Jerusalem of the first century of the Common Era. The Gezer Solomonic Gate. At the ancient site of Gezer, which has given us so much in the course of this journey, from its agricultural calendar to its standing stones to its water system and its boundary inscriptions, there is one more remarkable discovery to be considered, one that connects the physical remains of the site to one of the most ambitious building programs described in the biblical text. In the excavations conducted at Gezer by the Hebrew Union College Archaeological School in the 1960s and 1970s, archaeologists uncovered the remains of a large city gate, a massive mud brick and stone structure with 6 chambers arranged in 2 sets of 3 on either side of a central passageway, dating to the 10th century BC. The discovery of the Gezer Gate was immediately connected by the excavator, William Dever, to a passage in the first book of Kings that describes Solomon's building activities. Solomon conscripted forced labor to build the Millo, the wall of Jerusalem, Hazor, Megiddo, and Gezer. The same passage describes Solomon fortifying these cities. And at the sites of Hazor and Megiddo, which Yigal Yadin had already excavated in the 1950s and 1960s, 6-chambered gates of very similar construction and very similar dimensions had been found at levels associated with the same 10th century BCE period. 3 sites, 3 6-chambered gates, all mentioned in the same biblical passage, all built to remarkably similar plans, all dating to approximately the same period. The correspondence seemed to confirm, in physical stone and mud brick, the existence of a centralized Solomonic building program of the kind the biblical text describes. The Solomonic Gate identification has been debated, as everything in the archaeology of the early Israelite period is debated, with scholars arguing about the precise dating of the gates and the reliability of the biblical chronology and the degree to which the similarities between the gates at the 3 sites genuinely reflect a single architectural program rather than a shared regional building tradition. The debate continues, and it is unlikely to be resolved to everyone's satisfaction with the evidence currently available. But the gates are real. The similarities are real. The 10th century BCE date is real. And the correspondence with the biblical text, however its precise implications are weighed and assessed, is one of the more striking examples of the kind of convergence between the archaeological record and the biblical narrative that makes the study of biblical archaeology so endlessly fascinating and so endlessly contested. The gate at Gezer still stands, partially, in the open air of the excavated site, its mud brick courses preserved to a height of several meters in some places, its 6 chambers still recognizable in the ground plan, its massive stone threshold still lying where the ancient builders placed it. To stand in the gateway of ancient Gezer and look outward toward the Shephelah, toward the coastal plain, toward the horizon where the Mediterranean is invisible but somehow present in the quality of the light and the direction of the wind, is to stand in a place that has been a threshold for 3,000 years, a place where the inside and the outside of an ancient world met, where travelers entered and departed, where guards stood and watched, where the life of a city flowed through the controlled opening in its wall in the morning and evening rhythms that organized the day of every ancient city that has ever stood in the landscape of the ancient Near East. The Cairo Geniza. In the attic of the Ben Ezra Synagogue in the Fustat district of Cairo, the ancient city that preceded and underlies the modern Egyptian capital, there was, for approximately 1,000 years, a room with no windows and no regular access, into which the Jewish community of Fustat deposited the documents and manuscripts that could no longer be used but could not, according to Jewish religious law, be destroyed. Jewish law prohibits the destruction of any document that bears the name of God, and by extension the rabbis extended this prohibition to cover all religious texts, and eventually to many secular texts as well. Any written material in Hebrew script was deposited in the Geniza, the storeroom, to await eventual ritual burial in a cemetery. The Geniza of the Ben Ezra Synagogue accumulated documents across approximately 1,000 years, from the 9th or 10th century CE through the 19th, and because Cairo's dry climate preserved organic materials with remarkable efficiency, what accumulated in that room was one of the most extraordinary collections of historical documents ever assembled in a single place. The Cairo Geniza, as it came to be known after its contents were brought to scholarly attention in the 1890s, largely through the efforts of the Cambridge scholar Solomon Schechter, who traveled to Cairo in 1896 and brought approximately 140,000 manuscript fragments back to Cambridge, contains documents of every kind imaginable. Biblical manuscripts and Talmudic texts, prayer books and legal responsa, personal letters and business contracts, poetry and philosophy, medical texts and magical incantations, documents in Hebrew and Aramaic and Judeo-Arabic and Judeo-Persian, and a dozen other languages. It contains fragments of books that were known only by name and thought to be entirely lost, including portions of a Hebrew original of the Book of Ben Sira, or Ecclesiasticus, which had been known only in Greek translation for centuries before Schechter's discovery of Hebrew fragments in the Geniza. It contains personal letters of extraordinary intimacy, the letters of Jewish merchants in the Mediterranean trade networks of the medieval period, describing their voyages and their business dealings and their family concerns in the vivid, immediate language of people writing to each other across the distance of the sea. The Cairo Geniza is the single richest source of primary documents for Jewish life in the medieval Mediterranean world, and its contents continue to be studied, catalogued, and published more than a century after Schechter's discovery. The fragments are now distributed among libraries and collections around the world. Cambridge has the largest collection, but significant holdings exist in Oxford, New York, Paris, and many other institutions. Digital imaging projects have made thousands of fragments available online, and the painstaking work of matching fragments that were separated during the original dispersal of the collection continues to yield new documents and new connections as scholars piece together the puzzle of what was once a single room full of accumulated paper memory. The Ben Ezra Synagogue still stands in Cairo, restored and maintained, a place of quiet beauty in the ancient district of Fustat, its interior cool and dim and full of the particular silence that ancient religious buildings hold in their stones. The Geniza room is empty now, its contents dispersed to the libraries of the world. But standing in the synagogue and thinking about what was stored in the room above, the million fragments of 1,000 years of Jewish life in Cairo and across the Mediterranean, the letters and contracts and prayers and poems that accumulated there across century after century, deposited by hands that trusted the room to keep them safe, is one of the most affecting experiences that the study of the ancient and medieval Jewish world has to offer. The room kept its trust. The documents survived. And the voices they carry, of merchants and rabbis and poets and ordinary people going about their lives in the Jewish communities of the medieval Mediterranean, are still speaking in libraries and on digital screens, and in the scholarly journals that continue to publish their findings, with all the particularity and all the humanity of people who were alive and real and full of the same hopes and anxieties and loves that have always constituted a human life. The Isbit Sarda Abecedary. There is something about the alphabet that invites a particular kind of quiet wonder, not the dramatic wonder of a royal inscription or the haunting wonder of a burial shroud, but a slower, more intimate wonder, the kind that comes from recognizing something so fundamental, so woven into the fabric of everything we know and think and feel, that its origins seem almost too ordinary to contain the weight of what they gave the world. Every inscription we have visited on this long journey, every scroll and ostracon and papyrus and clay tablet and silver amulet, bears its testimony in letters, and those letters all descend, in one line or another, from a single ancient invention that changed the world more completely and more permanently than almost any other human achievement before or since. In 1976, excavations at a modest Iron Age settlement called Isbit Sarda, in the foothills between the coastal plain and the central highlands of Israel, uncovered a small pottery sherd bearing one of the most remarkable documents in the entire history of writing. Scratched into its surface in the early 12th century BCE, at the very beginning of the Iron Age, are approximately 80 letters arranged in 5 lines, and among them, in the bottom line, what appears to be a complete abecedary, the letters of the early alphabet written out in order from the first to the last. The letters are not perfectly formed, some awkward, some reversed, some inconsistent in their execution, in the way that letters written by someone still learning their shapes are always imperfect, always in the process of becoming what they will eventually be when the hand has fully learned what the mind already knows. Whoever scratched those letters into that sherd was a student, practicing the alphabet on the cheapest writing surface available, doing the ordinary, unglamorous work that precedes everything else. What that student was learning was not ordinary at all. The alphabetic script those imperfect letters practice is the direct ancestor of the Hebrew script in which the Torah was eventually written, of the Phoenician script the Greeks adopted into the Greek alphabet, of the Latin alphabet in which these very words are written. The entire literary heritage of the ancient biblical world, every scroll, every inscription, every document we have visited on this journey, traces its written form back to the alphabet that a student practiced on a pottery sherd in an Iron Age settlement in the foothills of ancient Canaan. They had no idea what the letters would eventually carry. They were simply sitting down with the basic tools and going through the fundamentals one more time, from Aleph to Taw, from the beginning to the end. The sherd was discarded into the refuse of the site and lay in the soil across 3,000 years of every kind of catastrophe and transformation the world has undergone, through the Israelite monarchy and the Babylonian exile and the Roman period and the Crusades and the Ottoman Empire, until the excavator's brush and the scholar's eye found it and recognized the extraordinary thing it carries. And the extraordinary thing it carries is simply this, that someone learned, that the alphabet was transmitted, one student at a time, one practice letter at a time, across an unbroken chain of human attention that has never, not once, not for a single generation, been allowed to break. The letters were learned and taught, and learned again. The words were copied and read and copied again. And the tradition held because there was always someone willing to sit down with a sherd or a scroll or a printed page and go through the letters one more time, making sure the thread was still in their hands and could still be passed forward. You're holding that thread now. You have been holding it all through this long journey, receiving what the ancient world has offered and carrying it, gently and gratefully, into the present moment. The student at Isbit practiced their letters 3,000 years ago so that the words of the Bible could eventually be written, read, and transmitted across the centuries. And you, in listening to this journey through its 101 artifacts, have done your part, receiving the testimony of the ancient world and carrying it one generation further into the future. That is enough. It has always been enough. The alphabet endures. The tradition endures. And when you wake and go out into the day and speak and write and read and wonder, you will be doing what that student was doing in their own smaller and more particular way, keeping the chain unbroken, passing the letters forward, doing what human beings have always done in every generation since the first letter was pressed into clay and the world was changed forever. The living tradition. We have come, at last, in this long and gentle journey, and it seems fitting that this final reflection should be not about a single artifact, but about something that all of the artifacts we have visited together represent and point toward. Something that cannot be held in a museum case or photographed for a publication or dated by radiocarbon or translated by a team of scholars. Something that is, in the deepest sense, still alive. Every artifact we have visited in the course of this journey, from the great Isaiah scroll to the Cyrus cylinder, from the Pilate stone to the Kitef Hinnom silver amulets, from the Megiddo ivories to the Cairo Geniza, from the Siloam tunnel inscription to the footprints at Ain Dara, every one of these objects was produced by a living community in the service of living purposes, out of the living materials of the world. The scribe who wrote the Isaiah scroll was not writing for posterity. He was writing for his community, for the people who would read and hear and pray the words he was copying in the scriptorium above the Dead Sea. The woman who wore the silver amulet with the priestly blessing around her neck was not wearing it as a historical artifact. She was wearing it because it said something true and important about the world she lived in and the God she trusted. The merchants who wrote their letters in the Cairo Geniza were not writing for scholars. They were writing to their families and their partners across the sea, telling them what they needed to know to conduct the affairs of life. What connects all of these artifacts, what gives them their particular and irreplaceable weight, is that they were produced by human beings in the act of living, in the full presence of the concerns and the hopes and the fears and the loves that constitute a human life in any century. They were not made to last. They were made to serve. The fact that they lasted is the accident, the fortunate, extraordinary, humbling accident of dryness and darkness and the patience of the earth. What they served is the point, the community that read the scrolls, the person who wore the amulet, the merchants who received the letters, the soldiers who watched for the fire signals, the pilgrims who walked the paved road toward the temple. And that community, the living community that produced these artifacts and used them and believed in what they represented, did not end with the destruction of the temple, or the fall of Jerusalem, or the Babylonian exile, or the Assyrian conquest, or any of the other catastrophes that the artifacts of this journey have witnessed and survived. It continued. It continues still. The words of the Isaiah scroll are still read, every year, in synagogues around the world. The Passover that the Elephantine Papyrus describes is still celebrated in homes and communities across every continent. The priestly blessing from the Ketef Hinnom amulets is still spoken in synagogues and churches and at bedsides and at the edges of graves, across every tradition that has inherited the world those silver scrolls came from. The ancient words are alive. The ancient tradition is alive. And the living tradition is, in the end, the most extraordinary artifact of all, the thing that the scrolls and the stones and the seals and the coins were all made to serve, and that has outlasted all of them, and that continues to speak and sing and pray and argue and question and remember in the voices of living human beings, in every language and every land, as it has always done, and as we must trust it will always do. We have traveled far in this journey. We have sat with objects that are 3,000 years old and objects that are 5,000 years old, and objects that have been waiting in the desert or the cave or the drainage channel for 2 millennia and more. We have read inscriptions carved by hands that have been dust for centuries. We have held, in imagination, in attention, in the quiet space of this long and gentle passage through the ancient world, the seals and the scrolls and the sherds and the stones of a world that is gone and not gone, that is past and not past, that is distant and not distant. Because the ancient world is not separate from us. We are its continuation, the latest link in the unbroken chain that runs from the first alphabetic inscription carved in Sinai through the scribes of Qumran and the merchants of the Cairo Geniza and the mosaic layers of the Byzantine churches and the monks who copied manuscripts by candlelight in their desert cells, and all the generations of readers and hearers and believers and doubters and scholars and ordinary people who have carried these words and these stories and these questions forward through time, one generation handing them to the next, one voice passing them to the one that follows, across every century and every catastrophe and every transformation that the world has undergone since the first human being looked at the evidence of existence and felt, simultaneously, the weight of mystery and the impulse to speak. That impulse, to speak, to record, to remember, to pass forward, is what all the artifacts of this journey represent. And we, who have received their testimony in this long and quiet night, are part of that same impulse. We have listened. We have received. And in receiving, we have become, in our own small way, another link in the chain, another generation that has sat with the ancient things and found them still speaking, still alive, still full of everything they have always had to say. Thanks so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this second and final part of our journey through the ancient biblical world. It has truly been an incredible adventure walking through thousands of years of history together. If you missed part 1, make sure you go back and check it out. The link is in the description below. If you enjoyed this one, please give it a like and hit subscribe to help support the channel. It really means the world. See you in the next one.